This man was humanity's only special class hero. But after saving the world, he was betrayed by the very people he protected, and in his despair, he received a system prompt offering him a choice: follow the path of humanity, or become the monster they fear. The weight of this decision heavy on his shoulders as he stared at the blinking text that seemed to mock his shattered ideals, his heart aching with the fresh sting of betrayal and the bitter irony of needing the approval of those who had cast him aside. And yet there was a strange calm in the realization that this choice might free him from the expectations and burdens that had been placed upon him since childhood. The promise of liberation, mingling with the creeping dread of what becoming a monster might truly mean, leading him to question everything he had ever believed about what it meant to be a hero. He stood in that silent hall, memories swirling like ghosts around him, recalling how once people cheered his name and placed garlands around his neck, how the council sat him at the table of honor and made him believe he was indispensable. Yet all of that had vanished with a single vote, leaving him to wonder if their admiration had ever been real. And the pain of this realization cut deeper than any sword, forcing him to reconcile the hero he had tried to be with the reality of a world that feared those it could not control. And as he recalled his endless hours of training, the blistered hands and sleepless nights spent preparing to protect them, he felt the irony of his situation press down on him like a weight, mocking his sacrifice, and he had to ask himself whether he had been naive to think that duty and loyalty could shield him from betrayal. Whether he had misinterpreted the smiles and praise, seeing gratitude where there had only been obligation. He paced the length of the chamber, boots echoing off ancient stone. Each step, a release of frustration and a reminder of the path he had walked to get here. And with every footfall, his mind conjured images of the demons he had faced, the monsters whose jaws he had pried open with his bare hands, the villages he had defended against hordes of undead. And he remembered the faces of the children he had saved, wide-eyed and trembling, clinging to his cloak like a lifeline, and he remembered the farmers who had bowed their heads in respect, the healers who had tended his wounds, and the soldiers who had fought beside him until their last breath. Juxtaposed against these images were those of the council members, their polished smiles and calculating eyes of nobles whispering behind fans and feigning kindness. And he felt anger simmer in his chest, hot and dangerous, because these memories showed him both the best and worst of humanity, and he knew that his decision would determine whether he continued to fight for the good or turned away from the world entirely. He lifted his gaze to the prompt again, the words unchanged, glowing with an eerie patience, and he wondered what kind of entity designed such a test. What sort of logic or cruelty underpinned a choice that required him to weigh his very identity against the love and trust of those he had once sworn to protect? And he felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat, because there was a certain irony in the fact that the system which had empowered him to be a hero now offered him the chance to become a monster, and he thought of the many times he had watched his enemies falter when given ultimatums, of the fear in their eyes as they faced their own mortality, and now he was on the other side, measuring his fear of losing his humanity against his fear of being used again. And in that comparison, he realized that clinging to humanity merely for others' sake had only brought him misery, while letting go could perhaps allow him to redefine himself on his own terms. Visions flickered at the edges of his consciousness, possible futures teased by the system's latent omniscience. And in one, he saw himself walking back into the kingdom, head bowed, power sealed, accepting the derision and suspicion of those who feared him, committing himself to a lifetime of menial tasks in exchange for a sliver of acceptance. And that vision filled him with a hollowness that made his stomach churn, because he could see the boredom and frustration eroding his soul, could hear the whispers that would never truly stop. And in another vision, he saw himself bathed in fire and shadow, leading an army of creatures that humanity had once deemed monstrous, dismantling corrupt thrones and establishing new laws based on his own sense of justice. And while the power of that image sent an electric thrill through him, it also warned him of isolation, of the loneliness that comes from being set apart, revered and feared in equal measure. And these glimpses reinforced that neither path was inherently perfect or damned, that what mattered was how he chose to walk it. He thought back to the few who had stood by him when rumor and suspicion started to swirl, the apprentice mage who had publicly defended him at the cost of her position, the old soldier who had refused to raise his sword against him during the mock trial. And these memories stirred something tender within him, reminding him that there were pockets of humanity that still held true to honor and loyalty. And he felt torn, because he did not want his bitterness toward the masses to tarnish the genuine kindness of the few. And he wondered if choosing the monstrous path would make it impossible to protect those people, or if perhaps his newfound freedom would grant him more control to safeguard them from behind the curtain of darkness. And as he pondered this, he realized that the true challenge was not in choosing a label, but in holding on to his core values regardless of the form he took, in ensuring that his integrity did not erode even as his body and role changed. He clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened, feeling the calluses grind against one another, a tactile reminder of the countless hours spent gripping a sword. And he let the physical sensation ground him in the present, pulling his mind away from the swirling what-ifs, because he knew that speculation could become a trap, a maze with no exit. And he focused instead on what he knew to be true, that the council had betrayed him, that he had given more than anyone had a right to ask, and that he was exhausted from fighting for a world that did not appreciate him, and with those truths in mind, he felt his resolve sharpen, because even though the future was uncertain, he did not need to see every step ahead to know that continuing down the same path would break him. And the realization that change was necessary filled him with a sense of reluctant acceptance, like bracing oneself before stepping into cold water. He pressed his palm against the floating text, feeling an unexpected warmth emanate from it, as if the system were a living being acknowledging his touch, and in that contact he felt information flow into him. Not as words, but as impressions, as intuitive understandings of the potential benefits and pitfalls of each choice. And he was struck by the fact that the system did not judge. It merely presented data and left the moral calculus to him. And this neutrality eased some of his resentment, because it implied that the system was not the manipulative puppeteer he had feared, but a tool whose use could be benevolent or malevolent depending on the wielder. And as he absorbed these impressions, he felt a sense of empowerment, because the system was effectively telling him that his values and actions, not its labels, would determine the nature of his path. And this reaffirmed his belief that he was more than the roles imposed upon him. Drawing a deep breath, he allowed himself to grieve for the life he thought he would have, for the dreams of retiring a celebrated hero and perhaps training the next generation, and he let the tears he had been holding back slip down his cheeks, not out of weakness, but as an acknowledgement that endings deserve to be mourned. And as he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, he felt a weight lift slightly, because grief expressed is lighter than grief carried in silence, and in that moment he silently thanked the boy he had been, the young warrior who had been so earnest and hopeful, for his dedication and bravery, promising to carry those qualities into whatever form he took next. And this internal promise was like a thread connecting his past and future selves, preventing the transformation from feeling like an absolute severing of identity. With his heart steadier and his mind clearer, he made his choice, speaking it aloud into the empty hall so that the words would reverberate and solidify in the air. And as the syllables left his lips, he felt a rush of energy pour through him, starting at his fingertips and racing through every vein and nerve, a sensation that was neither painful nor entirely pleasant, but powerful, like standing under a waterfall. And he closed his eyes and surrendered to it, trusting that the foundation he had built within himself, his values, his memories, his sense of right and wrong would remain intact even as the structure around it shifted, and he felt his muscles tighten and then relax, his senses adjust to new thresholds, his heartbeat slow and deepen, and when the flood of energy receded, he opened his eyes, feeling both entirely himself and completely altered, and he took a moment to breathe and appreciate that he had passed through the threshold intact. He glanced down at his hands, now tipped with faint claws that gleamed in the dim light, and flexed them experimentally, marveling at the strength and dexterity that coursed through his body. He could feel his senses expanding, picking up the subtle vibrations of sound and the faint scent of magic in the air, and he noted the new weight at his back, the unfurled potential of wings folded neatly against his spine. And he took a step and then another, each movement fluid and effortless, as if this body had always been his. And he smiled to himself. A small, genuine smile, because while he was undeniably changed, He also recognized the familiar cadence of his own thoughts, the steady rhythm of his moral compass. And he was reassured that the monstrous exterior did not dictate the contents of his heart. He walked to the entrance of the hall and pushed the heavy doors open, the outside world flooding in with light and sound. And as he stepped through, he felt the fresh air on his skin, cooler than he remembered. The scent of rain and earth mingling with the distant sounds of city life, and he paused on the threshold. Realizing that though everything had changed, so much remained the same, people still moved about their business. Children still laughed in alleyways, merchants still haggled over prices, and this continuity gave him a sense of peace, because it meant that the world did not hinge on his identity, that life would go on regardless of his role. And that freed him from the crushing burden of feeling solely responsible for everyone's safety and happiness. And he took his first step into the street not as a hero hoping for cheers, or as a monster seeking fear, but as a man determined to write his own story. He pulled his cloak tighter around him to conceal his new form, not out of shame, but because he needed time to adjust to learn how to move through crowded streets without drawing panic, and as he walked, he listened to the whispers around him. Catching fragments of his own legend being told at market stalls, rumors inflating his deeds and misdeeds into myths. And he smiled wryly, because he understood now that stories took on a life of their own, that the truth was malleable in the hands of those who needed heroes or villains. And he resolved not to spend his energy chasing these narratives, but rather to focus on the actions he could control, on the promises he had made to himself and to those who had shown him loyalty. And as he passed a group of children playing, one of them looked up and their eyes met, and in that brief connection he felt a sense of continuity, thread of humanity that remained unbroken. He ascended the familiar hill overlooking the city as dusk settled, remembering the hours he had spent here training, laughing, and dreaming with his comrades. And he allowed himself to sink into those memories, savoring the warmth they still held. And as he gazed over the rooftops, the setting sun casting long shadows across the streets, he felt the enormity of his journey press upon him, but instead of dread, he felt gratitude. Because without the betrayal, without the agony of this choice, he might never have realized the depth of his resilience, or the breadth of the world beyond the confines of duty. And he whispered a quiet vow to honor both the hero he had been and the monster he had chosen to become, blending their strengths to forge something new, something honest, something powerful. He turned his back on the city, facing the unknown wilderness beyond its walls, and his new wings unfurled with a rush of air. Catching the fading light, and with one final look at the place that had been both his home and his crucible, he leaped into the sky, his laughter carried on the wind, not out of triumph over others, but out of joy in claiming his life for himself. And as he climbed higher, the city shrinking below him, he felt an exhilarating sense of freedom, as he knew that he was no longer bound by the roles others had written for him, that from this moment forward he would be the author of his own legend. Guided by the steady compass of his heart and unshackled by the chains of a world that had failed to understand him. When he stepped out of the hall after making his choice, the night air greeted him like an old friend, and everything felt sharper. The sense of the city mingling with the distant hint of rain. The light of the moon reflecting off cobblestones with a clarity he had never experienced, and his new wings shifted instinctively, adjusting to the breeze that whispered around him. And though he kept them folded beneath his cloak, he could feel their potential, a latent power that made his heart pound with anticipation. And he drew his hood up, not out of shame, but to give himself a moment to acclimate, to process the shift within him before revealing it to a world that had already cast him aside. And as he walked down the steps into the street, he felt both liberated and strangely nostalgic. Aware that he was no longer the man who had entered the hall hours before, yet still tethered to his memories by threads he refused to sever. The city was quieter than usual, the late hour and the looming tension of recent events having driven most citizens indoors. And as he moved through the shadowed alleys and deserted market squares, he let his enhanced senses explore, noting the distant murmur of voices behind closed shutters, the scampering of rats across barrel tops, the metallic temps of recent rainfall on iron, and he marveled at the way his vision could pierce the gloom, picking out details that would have been invisible to his former self. Like the tiny dew droplets hanging from a spider web stretched between two crates, sparkling like diamonds in the moonlight, and while this heightened perception thrilled him, it also overwhelmed him at times, because alongside the beauty, he could also sense the fear and suspicion that lingered in the air. Collective unease that reminded him that these streets, once welcoming, now harbored whispers of his supposed fall into monstrosity. And he wondered how long it would take before the rumors became legends, and whether those legends would paint him as savior or scourge. He paused near a well where he had once shared jokes with fellow soldiers after long patrols, and he dipped his hand into the cool water, watching as ripples spread across the surface, distorting the reflection of his cloaked figure, and he thought about how water took the shape of whatever vessel contained it, and he wondered if he could be like water now, adapting to this new form without losing his essence. And the thought comforted him, because it suggested that transformation did not have to mean erasure, that identity could be fluid and resilient. And he drew his hand back and continued on, feeling the weight of his decisions settle more comfortably on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility he had willingly accepted. As he approached the city gates, the guards on duty stiffened, hands hovering near their weapons, their eyes narrowing as they took in his hooded figure. And he remembered their faces from better days, remembered sharing rations and stories with them, and he felt a pang of sadness that there was now a barrier between them, forged by fear and misinformation, and he decided to slip past without confrontation. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood that the guards were merely doing their duty, following orders from those above, and he did not want to punish them for the council's sins. So he waited for a cloud to cover the moon, deepening the shadows. And when darkness cloaked him, he unfolded his wings just enough to leap silently over the wall, landing on the other side with a grace that startled even him. And he took a moment to look back at the city that had been his home, whispering a silent farewell, before turning toward the open road and the uncertain adventures that lay ahead. The path away from the city led into rolling hills and dense forests, and as he walked beneath the towering trees, he felt the world open up around him. The air cleaner, the sounds of nature crickets, chirping leaves, rustling owls, hooting more vibrant than the hushed whispers of the city, and he let his senses stretch out, mapping the terrain, noting the faint trails left by deer and the distant scent of a fox den. And he realized how little he had truly seen of the world beyond battlefields and castle walls, because his duties had kept him tethered to the kingdom, and he felt a growing excitement at the prospect of exploration, tempered by the knowledge that danger lurked in these wilds and forms he had yet to encounter. And he welcomed that danger as a test of his new abilities and a chance to define the monster he was becoming. Somewhere deep in the forest, he detected the coppery scent of fresh blood and the harsh panting of a wounded creature. And curiosity mixed with caution as he moved toward the source, his footsteps silent on the moss-covered ground, and soon he came upon a small clearing where a stag lay on its side, an arrow protruding from its flank, its eyes wild with pain and fear, and standing over it was a young hunter, no more than 16, trembling in his hands as he struggled to finish what he had started. And in that moment the hero saw himself in the boy, the determination, the uncertainty, the desire to prove oneself. And he stepped forward, startling the hunter, who whirled and aimed his bow at him, eyes widening with terror as he took in the stranger's cloaked form and the faint glint of claws, and the hero raised his hands, palms up, speaking softly to calm the boy, to remind him that not all monsters attack, that sometimes they help, and he knelt beside the stag, his fingers moving deftly to remove the arrow and apply pressure to the wound, whispering to the animal in a soothing tone until its breathing slowed, and when he looked up, he saw the boy's expression shift from fear to awe, and he realized that this was his opportunity to redefine what it meant to be a monster. He instructed the hunter on how to care for the wound, showing him which herbs to gather for a poultice, explaining how patience and respect for life were as important as skill with a bow. And the boy listened intently, his initial terror replaced by curiosity. And when the hero finished, he asked the boy why he was hunting alone at such a young age. And the boy explained that his father had been called to fight in the demon wars, leaving him to provide for his family, and that they had heard rumors of the hero's fall, and had prayed that the council was wrong. And the hero felt a swell of emotion, because here was proof that despite the council's betrayal, there were still those who believed in him. And he promised the boy that he would continue to protect those who needed it, regardless of the labels others attached to him. And he stood and continued on his journey, feeling the weight of his vow settle alongside his transformation, reinforcing his commitment to use his power wisely. As night deepened, he found a sheltered glade near a stream and decided to rest. Spreading his cloak on the ground and lying back to stare up at the canopy of leaves through which he could see slivers of the starry sky, and he let the sounds of the forest lull him. The gentle gurgle of water over rocks, the distant call of a night bird, the occasional snap of a twig as some small creature passed nearby. And he thought about how different this peace was from the restless nights he had spent in barracks, surrounded by snores and the occasional shout of a soldier reliving battle in his dreams. And he felt a sense of belonging here, not because he had become one with nature, but because the forest accepted him without question, without expectation. And this acceptance was a balm to his wounded spirit, reminding him that there was more to the world than the judgment of a single kingdom. He closed his eyes and drifted into a light sleep, his enhanced senses still alert for danger. And in his dreams he saw images of himself flying above treetops, diving through clouds, racing the wind. And he awoke before dawn with a desire to test his wings, to feel the freedom that had only existed in his mind thus far, and he stood, stretching muscles that felt both familiar and new, and he unfurled his wings fully for the first time, marveling at their span. The way they caught the air like sails, and he crouched and leaped upward, powerful wing beats lifting him off the ground. And for a moment he wobbled, adjusting to the balance, and then he was soaring. The forest below a blur of green, the river a silver ribbon. And he laughed aloud, the sound carried away by the wind, because the sensation was exhilarating, a physical manifestation of the emotional freedom he had begun to feel. He flew for hours, sweeping over hills and valleys, swooping low to scatter a flock of birds that had been resting on a lake, rising high to ride thermal currents. And as the sun broke over the horizon, casting golden light across the landscape, he felt a warmth within him that went beyond the rays touching his skin, a warmth born from the knowledge that he had chosen, that he was no longer bound by the expectations of a council or the fears of a populace, that he was free to decide where to go and what to do, and with that realization came a sense of responsibility, because freedom without purpose could easily become chaos, and he vowed to use his wings not only to escape, but to reach those in need, to intervene where others could not, and to explore parts of the world that had been closed to him before. Later, he landed on a ridge overlooking a valley dotted with small farms, the smoke from their chimneys rising in lazy spirals. And he watched from afar as the inhabitants went about their morning routines, unaware of the figure standing on the hill above. And he thought about how easy it would be to remain aloof, to watch from the shadows and intervene only when necessary. And a part of him was tempted by that anonymity, by the idea of living apart from the judgment and politics of human society. But another part remembered the boy in the forest, remembered the warmth in his chest, when he had helped someone who saw past his claws and wings, and he knew he did not want to become a creature of solitude and indifference, that his humanity, even as a monster, compelled him to be engaged, to influence the world toward a better balance. And he resolved to seek out those moments where he could make a difference, whether in human towns or monster dens. As he continued his journey, he encountered creatures that both delighted and challenged him. A sprite that flitted around his head, giggling and tugging at his hair, a massive boar that charged him and tested his strength, and a serpent that spoke in riddles from a sun-warmed rock. And each encounter taught him something about his new place in the natural order, about how power must be tempered with respect, and as days turned into a week, he began to understand the rhythm of life outside the strict schedules of military command. And he felt his heart lighten, his mind expand, and his resolve deepen. Because the world was wide and varied, full of beauty and terror, and he was determined to experience it fully, not as a hero bound by duty, nor as a monster driven by rage, but as a being carving his own path. One evening he came upon a ruined shrine deep in the forest, its stones covered in moss, its altar cracked, and yet he felt an ancient power lingering there, humming in the air like a distant song. And he approached with reverence, placing his hand on the cool stone. And memories not his own flooded his mind, tales of agreements made between humans and spirits, of a time when balance was maintained not through force but through understanding. And he saw glimpses of rituals that had honored both light and dark, acknowledging that both were necessary. And he realized how far his world had fallen from that balance, how humans had sought to dominate, and how monsters had retaliated. And he wondered if perhaps part of his purpose was to restore some of that equilibrium, to act as a bridge rather than a sword, and the thought both humbled and energized him, offering a direction that resonated with the values he held dear. As he left the shrine, night fell again, and he found a perch high in a tree, wings wrapped around him like a cloak, and he gazed up at the stars. Those distant fires that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and he felt small in comparison, yet also significant, because every choice he made sent ripples through the lives around him. And he thought of the council back in the kingdom, of the conspiracies they were likely spinning. And he felt a flare of determination to one day confront them, not out of vengeance alone, but to demand accountability, to ensure they could not betray another hero as they had betrayed him. And with that resolve burning within him, he closed his eyes and allowed sleep to claim him, confident that when dawn arrived, he would rise and continue his journey, not as a runaway or a fugitive, but as the master of his own fate. Ask ChatGPT. Moving through the dense underbrush after leaving the shrine behind, he caught wind of smoke and the faint, panicked cry of someone calling for help, and he felt his heart quicken as he turned toward the sound, because the cry held within it the same desperation he had heard countless times on battlefields. And he sped through the trees with unnatural grace, branches barely brushing his cloak, until he burst into a clearing where a cart lay on its side, its contents scattered, and a woman stood between her daughter and 3 men with daggers drawn. Her body trembling, and without thinking he stepped between them, his wings unfurling to their full span in a motion so swift and sudden that it sent a gust of wind that knocked leaves from nearby. Branches and the men froze, their eyes widening at the sight of his claws and the faint glow of his eyes, and he could feel the rush of power thrumming through him, a primal thrill that urged him to strike, to teach these attackers a lesson they would never forget. He spoke, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable warning, telling the assailants to leave and never again prey on those who were weaker. And for a moment they hesitated, gauging his size and the lethal promise of his stance, and then one laughed nervously and lunged, blade flashing, and the others followed, and time seemed to slow as he met them, his movements precise and controlled, his claws deflecting steel and his tail sweeping a pair of legs out from under one man. And with each motion he felt a thread of temptation tugging at him, a dark whisper from within, urging him to sink his claws deeper, to let the taste of blood set the simmering fury he had kept bottled up since his betrayal. But he resisted, channeling the impulse into efficiency rather than brutality, knocking the daggers away, using the flat of his claws to strike pressure points and render his attackers unconscious. And when it was over, the men lay groaning on the ground, and he stood above them, breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the strain of holding himself back. And he realized that while violence could be intoxicating, restraint offered a different kind of satisfaction, one that aligned with the man he still wanted to be. He turned to the woman and child, who clung to each other, their eyes wide with fear and awe, inking himself, and knelt, making himself smaller, and he spoke gently, telling them they were safe now. He offered his hand to the little girl, who stared at it, at the claws that tipped his fingers, and then hesitantly reached out and placed her tiny hand in his, her fingers cool and trembling. And in that small contact, he felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with connection. And the woman thanked him, her voice thick with emotion, and she asked who he was. And for a moment he hesitated, unsure of how to answer, because to many he was a monster, to others he was still a hero, and he realized that he did not need to choose one label, that he could simply be someone who helped when he could. And he told her he was a traveler, and with that he helped them upright their cart, gathered their spilled goods, sent them on their way with a warning about the dangers ahead, and a reminder to seek shelter before nightfall. As he watched them disappear down the road, he felt the familiar ache of longing for acceptance ease slightly, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that he had protected someone without needing acknowledgement. And he turned back toward the forest, continuing his journey, and as he walked, he replayed the fight in his mind, examining the moments when the beast within had surged against his control. He decided that he needed to establish clear boundaries for himself, to set mental guardrails to keep from slipping into the very cruelty he despised. and he whispered those boundaries aloud to himself like a vow. He would never kill unless absolutely necessary. He would not revel in the fear of others. He would use his power to protect, not to intimidate. And the act of articulating these rules felt empowering, as if naming them gave him greater strength to adhere to them. Later that day, he came upon a band of trolls blocking a narrow pass between two cliffs. Their skin gray and mottled, their eyes glinting with suspicion, as they stopped travelers and demanded payment for passage. And he could see a line of merchants and farmers waiting, fear etched on their faces as they clutched their belongings. And he approached the trolls, aware that conventional wisdom would label them as brutes and encourage violence. But he remembered the goblins and their stories of displacement, and he held out his hands, palms up, and asked the trolls why they had chosen this place. And to his surprise, the largest troll, with tusks curving upward from his lower jaw, answered in gruff but clear common tongue, explaining that their lands had been overrun by soldiers and that they had no way to feed their families. And rather than attack, the hero listened, and he offered to guide them to a more fertile valley he had seen from the sky, where there were no humans to clash with. And though wary, the trolls agreed. And as they walked, he mediated between them and the merchants, helping each side see the other's perspective. And by the time they reached the valley, an uneasy truce had formed, and the merchants left unharmed. The trolls settled into their new home. And he realized that sometimes the best way to test his power was to use it to build bridges rather than walls. Not long after the trolls had departed, he heard footsteps on the path behind him, and turned to find a squad of armored soldiers flanked by a robed mage, their armor bearing the crest of the council. And their leader called out his name, not with respect, but with accusation, and they demanded he surrender, stating that he was under arrest for treason and unauthorized use of forbidden powers. And he sighed, feeling a weariness settle in his bones, because he could see in their eyes a mixture of fear and blind loyalty. And he knew that fighting them would not change their minds. It would only reinforce the narrative the council had spun. So he raised his hands slowly and spoke calmly, telling them he would not allow himself to be taken, that he had no intention of harming them unless they forced his hand. He could see them weighing their orders against their instinct for self-preservation. And after a tense standoff, the mage lowered her staff, whispering that she had once seen him save her cousin's life. And she turned and walked away, the others following, muttering about dishonor and fear. And as they disappeared into the forest, he felt a flicker of hope that acts of compassion could eventually undermine the lies told about him. That evening, as he camped beside a stream with water so clear he could see fish darting between stones, he felt the system's presence ripple across his consciousness. And new options appeared before him, skills that would amplify his rage, that would let him manipulate fear like a tangible force in others, that would allow him to soothe anger or heal minor wounds. And he understood that the system responded to his choices, offering paths that mirrored the duality within him, and he selected the latter, choosing to enhance his capacity for healing and empathy, because he saw these as tools to balance the destructive potential of his other powers. And as the system integrated the skills, he felt a warmth spread through his fingertips, and he tested it on a scratch on his forearm, watching in wonder as the skin knit itself together almost instantly. And he smiled, because this ability represented his commitment to foster life as much as he could, even as the world pushed him toward violence. He was awoken in the middle of the night by the rustle of undergrowth and the soft sobbing of someone nearby. And he rose silently and crept toward the sound, finding a young woman crouched beside the stream, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears, clutching a small bundle to her chest. And when she saw him, she gasped and drew back, eyes widening with fear, and he crouched low, keeping his hands visible, and asked her if she was hurt. And she shook her head and explained that she had fled from a forced marriage, that her family's debts had been sold to a man twice her age, and that she would rather die in the forest than be bound to him. And as she spoke, he could feel her despair and resolve, like physical sensations, and he realized that not all monsters had claws and fangs, that sometimes they sat in council chambers and dictated lives. And he offered to escort her to the nearest sanctuary, a monastery run by women who accepted those fleeing oppression. And she hesitated, then nodded, and they traveled together through the night, her initial fear gradually transforming into tentative trust as they spoke of her dreams and his. And by morning, they reached the monastery gates, and she turned to him and took his clawed hand in hers, whispering a thank you before disappearing inside, and he stood there for a moment, feeling a bittersweet blend of sadness for her plight and gratitude that he could help. As dawn painted the sky with pale colors, he continued his journey, mind heavy with the stories he had heard and the lives he had touched. And he wondered how many more like the young woman were trapped by human greed. How many trolls and goblins were driven to desperation by human expansion. And he understood that his fight was not just against demons or beasts, but against a system that created monsters by its own cruelty. And he felt a deep resolve settle within him, a commitment to address injustices wherever he encountered them, regardless of whether the victims had scales or skin, and he knew that this would complicate his path, that he would be seen as a traitor to his own species by some and as a monster by others. But he accepted that complexity, because living simply was no longer possible for someone like him, and as he walked, he whispered a promise to himself that he would not shy away from these moral challenges, that he would let them shape him into the kind of monster he could be proud of. By midday, he reached a crossroads where a traveling troupe of performers had set up a small stage. Their bright costumes, a stark contrast to the drab attire of the farmers and villagers gathered around, and he lingered at the edge of the crowd, watching as acrobats leaped and musicians played and storytellers spun tales. And he felt a pang of nostalgia for simpler times when he had laughed and clapped along with performances like this. And he let himself smile when a juggler caught 7 knives in quick succession. And as the show ended, the troupe passed a hat among the spectators, collecting coins and food, and as the hat approached him, he dropped in a gem he had taken off one of the marauders. And the troop leader, a tall woman with a painted face, looked up and locked eyes with him. And in that brief connection, he sensed that she knew who he was and was not afraid. And she nodded subtly, a sign of respect that warmed him, because it meant that even strangers who lived on the road, reliant on the goodwill of others, could see past the rumors and recognize the humanity beneath his wings and claws. That evening, after the troop had moved on and the sun had dipped below the horizon, he climbed a rocky ledge overlooking a lake, its surface like glass, reflecting the moon and stars, and he sat there, legs dangling over the edge, wings folded neatly behind him, and he took stock of his day, of the decisions he had made, the impulses he had resisted, and he allowed himself to feel proud, because he had managed to hold the line between beast and man, channeling his power for protection and healing. And while he knew that future challenges would test him further, he trusted that the rules he had set and the compassion he had cultivated would guide him. And as he sat, he saw a shooting star streak across the sky, and without thinking, he made a wish not for himself, but for the strength and wisdom to continue walking this narrow path between light and dark, and the wish soothed him, a reminder that hope was not naive, but necessary. When he finally lay down to rest, the earth cool beneath him, and the night sounds all around. He closed his eyes and let the gentle rhythm of the world lull him, and in his last waking thought, he acknowledged that this chapter of his journey had been one of testing and learning, of understanding that power was as much about restraint as it was about strength. And he drifted into sleep with the knowledge that he was beginning to master the beast within, shaping it to serve not only himself, but those who had no protector. And he welcomed the dreams that followed, because they were filled not with battles and betrayals, but with images of bridges being built, of hands reaching out across divides, and of a future where he could be both monster and guardian, unshackled by labels and defined by his choices. The deeper he ventured into the wilderness, the more the forest seemed to take on a life beyond the mere rustling of leaves and the calls of distant animals. And there were moments when he could swear he heard voices in the wind. Not words exactly, but whispers that carried meaning, laughter that seemed to dance between the branches, songs that resonated in his chest, and he slowed his pace, allowing himself to listen, to tune his senses beyond the physical, and gradually shapes emerged in the dappled light flickers of movement that resolved into diminutive beings with translucent wings, into tall figures with bark-like skin and eyes like pools of amber, and he realized with awe that the stories he had been told as a child, tales of spirits and guardians who protected the heart of the forest, were not mere myths, and his heart swelled with equal parts reverence and curiosity as he stepped into a clearing where ancient trees arched overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral, their roots twisted into intricate patterns that pulsed with a gentle glow. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing emerged a being taller than any human, her skin mottled green and brown, her hair a cascade of leaves and vines, and around her neck hung a necklace of river stones that glimmered with stored sunlight. And when she spoke, her voice was the rustle of wind through branches, and she named herself as Silvaria, a guardian of the old forest, one who had watched over these lands since before human memory, and she regarded him with a depth of knowledge that made him feel both exposed and seen. And she asked him why he had come, what his intentions were, and he felt compelled to answer truthfully, to speak of his journey, of his betrayal, of his choice to walk the line between humanity and monstrosity. And as he spoke, she listened without interruption, her gaze never wavering, and when he finished, she extended a hand, barked rough against his clawed skin, and she smiled, a slow, sad smile, and told him that the forest had been waiting for someone like him, someone who could hear the whispers and heed them, and that there were forces gathering in the world that would require a heart capable of bridging divides. Silvaria led him deeper into the clearing, past a pool of water so clear it reflected the sky like a mirror, and she knelt beside it, gesturing for him to sit, and when he did, she placed her hand gently on the surface, sending ripples across it. And images rose within the ripples, images of human settlers cutting down trees without ceremony, of monsters emerging from the shadows to strike at night, of frightened faces on both sides. And she spoke of the ancient pact that had once existed, an agreement that humans would take only what they needed and that monsters would protect the deep places. And she explained how greed had eroded that pact, how fear had twisted the stories into legends of evil creatures lurking in the dark. And she asked him if he would be willing to help restore the balance, to act as a mediator between worlds. And though the weight of such a task pressed heavily on him, he felt a stirring of purpose at the idea, because it resonated with the vows he had already made to himself. And he nodded, accepting the responsibility with the solemnity it deserved. To test his resolve, Silvaria guided him to a glen where 3 creatures waited, each representing a different aspect of the wild. A hulking bear with fur as silver as the moon, a lithe panther with eyes that glowed like embers, and a serpentine dragonling coiled around a fallen log, its scales shimmering iridescent in the filtered light. And she told him that each of these creatures carried grievances against humans, injuries inflicted by hunters or trappers, and that he must confront their pain without resorting to force, must find a way to communicate and soothe. And he approached the bear first, placing his hand on its scarred flank, feeling the tension in the muscle, and he projected calm and compassion, whispering apologies not for his own actions, but for those of his kind. And the bear huffed and leaned into his touch, eyes closing, and then he turned to the panther, meeting its fierce gaze without flinching, acknowledging the fear that had driven people to try to kill it. And finally, he addressed the dragonling, speaking to it in halting phrases of its old tongue that he learned from the system, promising that not all humans sought its demise. And when he finished, the 3 creatures relaxed, their aggression easing, and Silvaria nodded in approval, saying that words and empathy could be mightier than claws and fangs when dealing with those who had been wronged. Afterward, he sat with the creatures, sharing in a meal of fruits and herbs that Silvaria provided, and as they ate, they told him stories of the forest from their perspectives. The bear spoke of the grief it felt when its mate was killed by a hunter seeking glory. The panther described the terror of fleeing from torches and arrows, and the dragonling recounted how it had been blamed for a drought it did not cause. And through their stories he saw the pattern of misunderstanding and fear of humans, lashing out at what they did not comprehend, and he realized that monsters were not born malevolent, but were shaped by the pain inflicted upon them, and in their eyes he saw reflections of his own anger and sorrow. And he understood that healing his world would require healing these wounds and that he could not do it alone. But perhaps he could catalyze change by sharing these stories with those willing to listen. Before he left the glen, Silvaria warned him that not all creatures would be as willing to open their hearts, that there were those who had embraced the darkness within them fully, becoming what the stories had always said they were. And she told him of a pack of warped wolves, that had recently taken up residence near the northern edge of the forest. Wolves twisted by dark magic and driven by a hunger that nothing could sat, and she asked him to go to them, not to fight them, but to learn what had corrupted them. And he agreed, feeling a chill at the thought of facing beings consumed by darkness, but also a determination to understand. Because if he could uncover the source of their corruption, perhaps he could prevent others from meeting the same fate, and he set off in the direction Silvaria indicated, the ground soft beneath his feet, the air growing cooler as he moved north. As he approached the northern ridge, the once vibrant forest grew silent, the birdsong fading into a heavy stillness. And the trees here bore marks-deep claw gouges and blackened bark that spoke of fire and suffering. And the air carried a faint metallic scent that made his nose wrinkle. Soon he saw them. Wolves larger than any he had seen before, their fur matted and patchy. Their eyes clouded with a milky sheen, and when they noticed him, they snarled, lips curling to reveal jagged teeth, and he could feel the darkness in them, like a sickness. And when he reached out with his empathy, he encountered not just hunger, but an emptiness, a void where something vital had been ripped away, and he realized that these wolves were victims, not villains, their natural instincts twisted by some external force, and he looked for clues. Spotting strange symbols etched into the rocks nearby, symbols that pulsed with a faint, malevolent energy, and he recognized them from ancient texts as markings used by dark mages to bind spirits and siphon power. And his anger flared, not at the wolves, but at those who had done this to them. Understanding that the wolves' aggression was not entirely their own, he chose to avoid confrontation, instead tracing the symbols back to their source. Following a trail of disturbed earth and withered plants until he reached a cave where the stench of decay was overwhelming. And inside he found remnants of rituals' bones arranged in patterns, candles burned down to stubs, and in the center, a stone altar stained dark, and as he approached, the system flashed a warning across his vision, indicating that residual dark magic lingered here. And he felt it, a throbbing malevolence that tugged at his own darker impulses. And he had to focus on his inner light on his vows to keep it from overwhelming him. And he placed his hands on the altar and whispered words of cleansing he had learned from Silvaria, and he channeled the healing energy he had recently gained through the system, pouring it into the stone, and he felt resistance at first, the dark magic pushing back, but he persisted. And gradually the oppressive feeling lifted, the symbols fading. And outside he heard the wolves' snarls soften into whines, and when he emerged, he saw them shaking their heads, confusion replacing rage, their eyes clearing, and he realized that by removing the source of their corruption, he had given them a chance to return to themselves. He spoke softly to the wolves, telling them that they were free to return to their pack to choose their own path. And they regarded him with cautious curiosity before melting back into the forest, and he stood there for a moment, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that he had confronted darkness without violence. And he reflected on the lesson that not all evil was intentional, that sometimes it was the result of manipulation, and that removing the root cause could restore balance. And he vowed to remember this as he continued his journey, to always look beyond the surface of an enemy's actions, to understand the forces at play. On his way back through the forest, he encountered a hunting party of humans, heavily armed and speaking in hushed, excited tones about the monstrous wolves they intended to kill. And he stepped into their path, stopping them in their tracks. And when they raised their spears defensively, he held up his hands and explained that the wolves were no longer a threat, that they had been controlled by a dark force now dissipated, and the hunters scoffed, accusing him of lying, saying that monsters could never be trusted. And he felt his temper flare, but he took a deep breath and recounted the story of what he had witnessed, describing the symbols and the ritual and the change in the wolves, and he could see skepticism in their eyes begin to waver, replaced by doubt. And he asked them what they truly sought, safety or vengeance. And after a long silence, the leader lowered his spear and nodded, saying they would return to their village and watch for any sign of danger before acting. And this small concession felt like a victory, because it meant that humans, too, could learn to question their assumptions. When he returned to Silvaria, she listened to his recounting of the wolves and the dark ritual, her expression grave. And she thanked him for his compassion, and for his willingness to look beyond surface appearances. And she told him that dark mages had been stirring in recent years, seeking to sow discord between humans and monsters for their own gain. And she warned him that he would likely encounter more of their handiwork, and she pressed a seed into his palm, explaining that it was from the heart of an ancient tree, and that if planted in a place of corruption, it would purify the land. And he accepted it, feeling its subtle, pure energy pulsing against his skin, and he slipped it into a pouch at his belt, promising to use it wisely. And he thanked her for her guidance, and she smiled, telling him that the forest would always be with him, whispering hints and warnings if he listened carefully. As the day waned, he sat at the edge of a stream, ancient seed warm against his skin, and he contemplated all he had learned in this chapter of his journey, about the complexity of monstrosity and humanity, about the importance of seeking causes rather than reacting to symptoms, about the power of empathy to heal wounds inflicted by ignorance and fear. And he realized that his path would require not just strength of body, but depth of heart. And he felt the forest around him whisper its approval. And as he closed his eyes and let the sounds of the water soothe him, he knew that the next steps would lead him toward deeper mysteries, perhaps toward the hidden temple the system had hinted at, and he breathed in the cool, clean air, ready to face whatever awaited him with the knowledge that he was not alone in his struggle. That there were allies among monsters and spirits who believed in the possibility of harmony, and with that comforting thought, he allowed himself to rest, the whispers of the forest lulling him into sleep. The morning after Silvaria gave him the ancient seed, he set out toward the rumored temple that the system had hinted lay hidden in the mountains to the east. And as he traversed the rocky foothills, the terrain grew steeper, the paths narrower, and the air thinner. And though he relished the challenge, he remained alert, because he knew that such secluded areas often harbored dangers both natural and unnatural, and his caution was rewarded. When just as he crested a narrow ridge, a group of figures burst from the rocks above him, leaping down with the ferocity of mountain lions, their faces obscured by cloth masks, their weapons gleaming, and they moved with coordination that spoke of training rather than desperation. A bandit group that preyed on travelers, and he had time only to raise his arms in defense as they descended. Their swords and spears aimed at his head and heart, and he braced himself for impact, hearing the whisper of blades cutting air. Feeling the thrill of impending combat stirred the beast within him. He met the first attacker, head-on, claws catching the spear's shaft and snapping it in two, his tail sweeping another bandit off his feet. But there were more than he expected, and as he fought, another presence entered the fray. A blur of shadow and steel that darted between attackers with deadly precision. And he caught glimpses of crimson eyes and dark hair, of daggers flashing in the morning sun. And together they moved like a well-rehearsed dance despite never having met, each covering the other's flank without communication, and soon the bandits realized they were outmatched and fled, leaving their fallen comrades groaning on the rocky ground. And when the last of them disappeared over the ridge, he turned to face the newcomer, his muscles tense, ready to defend if necessary, and found himself looking at a woman whose very presence exuded both danger and grace. She wore a cloak as dark as midnight, beneath which he glimpsed scales tracing her collarbone, and her eyes, though human in shape, held a luminescent glow that marked her as something more. They stood in silence for a long heartbeat, each assessing the other, and then she inclined her head slightly, a gesture that could have been acknowledgement or mockery, and she sheathed her daggers with practiced ease, the blades disappearing into hidden scabbards at her waist. She introduced herself as Lysandra, a wanderer of no fixed home and no allegiance to any crown, and her voice carried a weight that suggested ages of experience despite her youthful appearance, and he returned the courtesy, telling her his chosen name and offering no titles, and he saw a flicker of recognition cross her features, not of his face, but of the story that had spread through taverns and markets of the hero who became a monster, and she did not recoil. Instead, she laughed softly, saying that the world needed more monsters like him, because those who were entirely human had proven themselves far worse. And her words held both humor and bitterness, and he felt an unexpected relief that someone else understood that humanity was not a guarantee of virtue. They decided, without discussing it, to share a fire that evening. Because the mountains offered few shelters, and because each was curious about the other, And as they sat beneath a rocky overhang, the flames casting flickering light on their faces, they spoke in cautious truths, sharing fragments of their stories like pieces of a puzzle. And Lysandra told him that she had once been human, a healer in a remote village, till a plague swept through and desperate villagers turned to dark magic for a cure, ritual that had gone awry and bonded her with a shadow spirit, giving her abilities that saved many but terrified the survivors who had exiled her as a witch. And she had wandered since, using her powers to help those in need, while fending off those who sought to exploit or destroy her. And as she spoke, he listened intently, finding in her tale echoes of his own, the desire to save the ungratefulness of those saved, the transformation into something feared, and he felt a kinship form, a bridge built not of shared species, but of shared experiences of betrayal and resilience. In return, he told her of his life as the special class hero, of the training and battles, of the cheers that turned to whispers, of the council's vote and the system's prompt. And her eyes darkened with anger when he spoke of the betrayal. And she shook her head at the foolishness of those who throw away their protectors, and she confessed that she had little love for human institutions, for councils and kings who hid behind laws and sacrifices while demanding loyalty and obedience. And he saw the passion in her words, the fiery conviction that guided her actions. And he found it both inspiring and grounding, because it reminded him that his anger was not unique, that others had been wronged by the same structures. And she told him that she had heard whispers in the shadows about dark mages, about a cult seeking to destabilize the tenuous peace between humans and monsters, and that she had been tracking their movements, looking for allies who could help her stop them. He showed her the ancient seed Silveria had given him, explaining its purpose and the promise he had made to restore balance where corruption festered. Lysandra took the seed delicately, holding it up to the firelight, and her eyes softened as she felt its pure energy, and she said that such objects were rare and precious, that they must be protected from those who would use them selfishly. And she surprised him by revealing that she had once seen a similar seed planted in a village cursed by pestilence, and how within days the land had healed and the sickness had vanished. And she vowed to help him safeguard it, because she recognized that their goals, hers of thwarting the dark mages and his of restoring balance, intertwined. And they agreed to travel together at least until their paths diverged, knowing that combined they stood a better chance against the threats looming in the shadows. Their partnership was tested sooner than expected, when 2 days later they stumbled upon a ravine where a bridge had been destroyed, and on the far side a group of pilgrims huddled, trapped between the broken bridge and a pack of demons that prowled along the ridge. Demons with spiny backs and gnashing teeth. And the pilgrims' families with children. Elders leaning on staffs cried out when they saw the two strangers pleading for help. And without hesitation, Lysandra unsheathed her daggers and moved with fluid precision, casting shadows that coalesced into tendrils that entangled the demons, slowing their advance, while he leaped across the ravine, his wings beating strongly to carry him, and he landed among the demons, claws flashing, tails sweeping, and between them they created a corridor of safety. Lysandra's shadows binding and blinding his strength and resilience, breaking their assault. And together they shepherded the pilgrims across a path. He formed by uprooting a fallen tree and laying it across the gap, and once everyone had crossed, he pushed the tree into the ravine, blocking the demons from following. And when the last pilgrim was safe, he and Lysandra stood side by side, breathing hard, adrenaline thrumming, and they looked at each other and smiled, a shared sense of accomplishment warming them. That night, as they rested near a quiet stream, Lysandra joked that between his claws and her shadows they made quite the fearsome duo, and he laughed, the sound surprising him by its ease. And he realized how much he had needed this someone to share the burden. Someone who understood the weight of power and the cost of using it. And as they spoke, their walls came down further, and Lysandra confessed that she sometimes feared the shadow spirit within her would overtake. Her will that its hunger for darkness would drown out her compassion, and he admitted that his own beast still whispered temptations in the heat of battle, and they promised to hold each other accountable, to call out signs of slipping, and they devised signals and phrases to check in with one another, creating a system of mutual support. And in that moment, a partnership solidified, not born of convenience alone, but of trust and respect, and he felt lighter, as if sharing his path with someone else dispersed the weight evenly across their shoulders. The system seemed to acknowledge their alliance, because later that evening a new notification appeared. offering a cooperative quest. A request to investigate a series of attacks on villages near the temple he sought. Attacks attributed to shadow beasts, but suspected to be orchestrated by the same dark mages they wished to confront. And the reward included an ability that would allow two beings to synchronize their powers temporarily, increasing their effectiveness when working together. And they looked at each other, and without hesitation, accepted. Understanding that their fates were intertwining in ways neither had anticipated, and he felt a surge of excitement at the prospect of honing their teamwork, of learning to combine his physical prowess and empathy with her stealth and magic. And she nodded, her expression determined, and they agreed to depart at first light toward the affected villages. As they walked toward their new destination the next morning, the sun casting long shadows before them, they talked about logistics and strategies, but they also spoke about small things, the foods they missed, the stars. They favored the songs they hummed. When alone, and he found joy in these ordinary conversations because they reminded him that even in a world where betrayal and danger lurked, there were still simple pleasures to be shared. And he realized that companionship did not diminish his autonomy, but enhanced it, adding layers of perspective and warmth to his journey. And he thought back to his vow to be a bridge between worlds and recognized that building bridges within himself, between the human and the monster, required bridges outside himself as well, connections with others who walked similar paths. They arrived at the first village by midday, greeted by the sight of charred houses and frightened faces. And the villagers, upon seeing Lysandra's shadow-touched aura and his monstrous features, flinched, but desperation overcame their fear, and they told of attacks that came at night. Creatures that seemed to emerge from the ground and vanish into thin air, leaving destruction and despair. And as he and Lysandra examined the attack sites, they found traces of ritual circles and symbols similar to those in the cave he had cleansed. And Lysandra whispered that this was indeed the work of the dark cult, and together they devised a plan to set a trap. Using their combined abilities to root out the source, and as dusk fell, they took up positions, heart steady, ready to face whatever horrors the night would unleash. Lying in wait beneath the cover of darkness, listening to the village settle into uneasy sleep, he felt Lysandra's presence beside him, a comforting steadiness, and he knew that whatever emerged from the shadows, they would face it together. And he realized that this alliance marked a turning point in his journey, a shift from solitary wandering to purposeful partnership, and he allowed himself a moment to appreciate the unexpected twists that life offered, the way pain could lead to healing and loneliness to companionship. And as the first tendrils of unnatural shadow began to seep across the ground, heralding the arrival of the creatures they sought, he felt no fear, only resolve, and he whispered to Lysandra that they were not alone in this fight, that they fought for more than themselves. And she squeezed his shoulder in agreement. Together they prepared to step into the darkness and pull the puppeteers into the light. As night fully descended upon the village, a hush fell over the thatched roofs and dirt paths, broken only by the nervous whispers of villagers huddled behind shuttered windows. And then, as if on cue, tendrils of inky darkness seeped from cracks in the earth, coalescing into shapes that slithered and then erupted upward, forming creatures of shadow with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. And at their emergence a chill swept through the air, causing the flames of torches to flicker and die, and he felt the tension in his muscles coiled like a spring as he took his position alongside Lysandra, whose own eyes gleamed with determination. And when the first of the shadow beasts lunged, its form shifting fluidly between solid and ethereal, he met it with a swipe of his claws, which glowed faintly with the purifying energy of the ancient seed he carried. And the beast shrieked, its body dissolving like mist, and beside him, Lysandra's shadows darted forward, binding to more creatures in tendrils that rooted them to the ground, allowing him to dispatch them with swift, measured strikes. The beasts came in waves, their forms flickering and reforming, and with each wave he and Lysandra adapted, their movements synchronizing more seamlessly, her shadows creating barriers that funneled the creatures into his reach. His claws and tail delivering blows that combined brute force with the cleansing energy of the seed, and as they fought, he felt a sense of exhilaration at the partnership. A thrill, not just from the combat, but from the harmony of working with someone who matched his pace and complemented his strengths. and yet as his senses expanded, he caught the faint scent of something human amidst the darkness. A tang of sweat and fear that did not come from the villagers watching, but from somewhere behind the beasts. And he realized that there were living minds guiding the shadows, and he signaled to Lysandra, and she nodded, her own perception having detected the same, and she sent her shadows out like a net, probing the darkness until they encountered resistance. And then she pulled. And from behind a dilapidated barn were dragged two hooded figures clutching talismans etched with the same symbols he had seen in the corrupted cave, their eyes wide with terror as their cover was torn away. As the hooded figures stumbled into the open, the shadow beasts faltered, their movements becoming erratic and uncoordinated, and he seized the moment to drive them back, his strikes burning away their essence. And when the last of the creatures dissolved into wisps that evaporated into the night, he turned his attention to the humans, responsible, who tried to scramble away, muttering incantations that fizzled as Lysandra's shadows wrapped around their wrists and ankles, binding them tightly. And he approached, towering over them, and he demanded to know why they had unleashed such horrors on innocent people. And the taller of the two spat at him, calling him an abomination and saying that the cult would cleanse the world of both monsters and traitors. And the hatred in the man's eyes was a mirror of the fear he saw in some of the villagers watching from their doorways. And he felt a sour mixture of anger and pity, because these men were both perpetrators of evil and victims of a twisted ideology. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement and turned in time to catch a small child who had slipped out of her mother's arms and darted toward him, perhaps drawn by curiosity or driven by gratitude. And as he scooped her up, her tiny arms wrapped instinctively around his neck, her cheek pressing against the scales at his collarbone, he felt a swell of protectiveness. And he smiled softly, but when he looked up, he saw the mother hesitate, her hand half extended, her expression torn between relief that her daughter was safe and fear of the monster holding her. And he crouched down and gently placed the child back into her mother's arms, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, and he heard whispers ripple through the gathered villagers, some murmuring prayers, others calling him guardian, still others saying the word demon under their breath, and the cacophony of judgment and gratitude washed over him in waves. With the shadow beasts gone and the culprits bound, the villagers began to emerge from their homes, lanterns held high, illuminating the scene with a warm, quivering light. And an elder stepped forward, his back bent with age, eyes sharp with intelligence, and he thanked them on behalf of the village, his voice steady even as his hands shook. And he offered them food and shelter in gratitude. But as he spoke, a younger man behind him muttered loudly that they should not welcome monsters, that even if tonight's attack had ended, there was no guarantee these two wouldn't turn on them, and the elder turned and hushed him. But the words hung in the air, heavy and divisive, and the hero felt them sink into him, stinging more than any physical blow. And he took a deep breath before responding, telling the villagers that, whether they accepted him or not, he had acted to protect them, and that he would continue to do so, if needed, because his conscience demanded it, not their approval. Lysandra stepped forward then, her voice like the hiss of wind through reeds, and she spoke of the dark cult manipulating fears to pit humans and monsters against each other. And she told the villagers that ignorance was a tool of tyranny, that their distrust was understandable given the stories they had been fed, but that it could also be their downfall. And she urged them to look at actions rather than appearances, at intentions rather than stories. And her words carried a weight that made several villagers lower their gazes in shame. And the elder nodded slowly, saying that fear had long kept them alive, but it could not be allowed to dictate their every decision. And he reiterated his offer of hospitality, which the hero politely declined, knowing that lingering might only fan the flames of division, and instead he requested provisions and water for their journey, which were provided reluctantly by some and willingly by others. They took the two captured cultists with them, binding their hands and gagging them to prevent spellcasting, and as they walked through the night, the prisoners stumbled and cursed, occasionally spewing propaganda about purging the world, and he listened, trying to glean information between the vitriol and eventually one of the captives, perhaps sensing that his fate depended on cooperation, offered a bargain. He would reveal the cult's next target in exchange for his life. And Lysandra looked to him, her expression unreadable. And he considered the choice, the balance between justice and pragmatism. And he agreed to listen, promising nothing, The cultist whispered a location, a coastal town where the cult planned to summon a greater shadow beast to devour the harbor and disrupt trade, and the information felt true in his bones. And he nodded, telling the cultist that his life would be spared, but his freedom would not, and that he would answer for his crimes before the village elders of the towns he had harmed. And the man sneered, but said nothing more. As dawn approached and they paused to rest, Lysandra sat by the fire, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames, and she asked him how he felt, not about the battle, but about the villagers' reactions, and he stared into the embers, feeling the echoes of their whispered fears and grudging gratitude, and he confessed that it hurt, that it was exhausting to fight for people who looked at him as if he were one of the monsters he fought against, and that part of him wanted to withdraw, to save only those who welcomed him, but that his moral compass would not allow him to be so selective, because he knew what it felt like to be judged and abandoned, and he could not perpetuate that cycle. And Lysandra reached out and placed her hand on his, her touch light but grounding, and she said that change was slow, that fear was stubborn, but that every act of kindness, every life saved, chipped away at the walls people built, and that someday, perhaps, they would see him for who he was, rather than what he looked like. The system chimed softly in his mind, offering a moral choice: to deliver the cultists to the nearest human authorities, who might execute them without learning anything more, or to keep them as sources of information, risking that they might attempt to escape. And he weighed the options, considering the potential harm of both actions, and he asked Lysandra for her opinion, and she said that knowledge was a weapon as powerful as any blade, and that they should learn what they could before handing them over, ensuring that the cycle of violence was disrupted at the source. And he agreed, making the decision to interrogate the cultists further, extracting information on the cult's structure and plans before ultimately turning them over to the towns they had wronged, where a more nuanced form of justice might be possible, and the system affirmed his choice, awarding them a small increase in persuasion ability, a subtle shift that would help them in future conversations. And he felt a sense of alignment with his values, appreciating that the system rewarded thoughtful decision-making. They continued toward the coast, their path taking them through rolling hills and along river banks. And as they traveled, he found himself thinking about the villagers who had both thanked and insulted him. And he realized that humanity was not a monolith, that within any community there would be those who clung to fear and those who were willing to challenge it. And he resolved to focus on the latter, to nurture the sparks of understanding where he found them, and Lysandra agreed, telling him stories of villages she had revisited months after helping them, where initial fear had been replaced by respect. And he took comfort in these stories, seeing them as proof that change was possible, albeit slow. 8. And he wondered if perhaps his purpose extended beyond fighting creatures and cults, if perhaps it also involved teaching humanity to see beyond the surface, to recognize that monsters could be allies, and that evil could wear a familiar face. That night, as they set up camp near a grove of willows, whose branches dipped gracefully into a shimmering pond, he took the ancient seed from his pouch and held it in his hand, feeling its steady warmth. And he thought about where he might plant it, about the places of corruption that most needed purifying. And his mind drifted to the coastal town the cultist had mentioned, imagining dark magic seeping into the water. And he decided that if the cult truly planned to strike there, he would carry the seed into the heart of their ritual and use it to cleanse whatever darkness they summoned. And he shared this plan with Lysandra, who nodded, her eyes reflecting both concern and admiration. And she reminded him that they would need to time it carefully, and to ensure the seed was not corrupted by the ritual itself. And together, they strategized late into the night, their conversation interspersed with lighter topics that kept their spirits buoyed. And as he lay down to sleep, he felt the echoes of humanity's fear fade into the background, replaced by a growing confidence in the path he had chosen and the companions he had found. In the early hours before dawn, just before sleep claimed him, he stared up at the canopy of leaves overhead, the stars peeking through small gaps. And he reflected on the day's lessons, that heroism was not validated by applause, that humanity's perception of him would vary and could not be his guiding star, that alliances born in shadow could light the way forward, and that confronting darkness required both strength and understanding. And he drifted off with a quiet determination to continue walking this path, knowing that the echoes of humanity's fear would follow him, but trusting that his actions would speak louder, and that over time, perhaps, those echoes would transform into whispers of respect and gratitude. And he smiled as sleep finally took him, comforted by the knowledge that tomorrow he would rise and continue the journey, not as a lone monster, but as a bridge between worlds, supported by allies and strengthened by resolve. Their journey toward the coastal town took them through bustling trading posts and quiet hamlets. And at one such market they paused to rest and purchase provisions, only to find a crowd gathered around a troupe of minstrels, their fingers plucking at lutes and their voices rising in a ballad that told of a hero who had become a monster, of wings that blotted out the sun and claws that tore through demons. And as the verses unfolded, he recognized fragments of his own story twisted into grandiose exaggerations, his betrayal described as a curse, his choice framed as a fall into darkness, and he stood in the back of the crowd, who'd drawn low, listening to the laughter and gasps of the audience, feeling a complex mix of irritation at the inaccuracies and fascination at the way his life had already become myth. And when the song ended, coins clattered into the minstrels' hats, and he turned to Lysandra, who smirked and whispered that it was only a matter of time before children played at being him in the streets. And her words made him chuckle, despite himself, because even as the song distorted his reality, it also kept his deeds in people's minds, and he wondered how much influence he had over the way his legend would evolve. They resumed their journey, discussing the power of stories to shape perception. Lies. And Lysandra told him of a village that had been spared an attack, because the marauders believed a dragon protected it, though no such creature existed, proving that fear of the unknown could deter violence as effectively as strength. And he considered whether his own legend could serve a similar purpose, whether rumor could be wielded like a sword to protect those who had not yet learned to trust him, and he decided that he would not chase down every falsehood, because to do so would be as futile as catching the wind, but he would ensure that his actions continued to speak louder than the songs, shaping reality in ways that stories would eventually reflect with greater truth. When they finally reached the coastal town, the scent of salt and fish filled the air, mingling with the cries of gulls and the shouts of dock workers unloading cargo from ships, and the town was alive with commerce, sailors and merchants bartering over crates of goods, children weaving between stalls, their pockets sticky with stolen fruit. And as he and Lysandra entered the main square, faces turned toward them, conversations paused, whispers darted like minnows through the crowd, and he could hear his name spoken in hushed tones, some with reverence, others with fear. And he adjusted his hood, but his stature and the hint of wings beneath his cloak could not be fully concealed, and for the first time he experienced being both a celebrity and a specter, a figure whose presence electrified the air with anticipation and apprehension. They sought out the local magistrate, a stern woman with salt-streaked hair who oversaw justice in the port. They delivered the cultists into her custody, detailing the crimes committed and the information gleaned, and the magistrate listened with a tight jaw, her eyes darting to his claws, and then to Lysandra's shadowed aura, and she thanked them for their aid, even as she maintained a careful distance, promising a fair trial, but also advising them to leave town quickly, because their presence might incite unrest. And as they exited the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered, some curious, some hostile, and a man shouted that monsters were not welcome, while a woman threw a bouquet of herbs at his feet, a traditional sign of blessing, and the duality of the response struck him anew, reaffirming that his existence would always draw opposing reactions. Determined to understand the cult's plans, they walked the docks, talking to fishermen and sailors, listening for whispers of unusual happenings. And a fisherwoman with sun-browned skin and calloused hands told them of dark shapes lurking beneath the waves at night, of nets being dragged down by unseen forces, and of strange chanting heard near the old lighthouse. And her eyes flicked to the ancient seed he carried when its warmth pulsed through his cloak. And she crossed herself and murmured that perhaps the monster in their midst was the answer to their prayers. And he thanked her for her courage in sharing what she knew, feeling the weight of expectation settle upon him. As dusk settled over the harbor, painting the water in shades of mauve and gold, he and Lysandra investigated the lighthouse, its stone walls slick with sea spray. They found symbols etched into the foundation, glowing faintly with residual dark magic. and Lysandra sent her shadows down into the water, tracing lines that led to a cavern beneath the cliffs where the rituals had taken place. And he felt the pull of the seed, its warmth responding to the corruption below. And he knew they had found the right place, and they made plans to return at midnight, when the cultists would likely gather to attempt their summoning. As they walked back through town, they passed a tavern where sailors were drinking and boasting, and through the open window he heard snippets of conversation. One man swore he'd seen the monster hero tear demons apart with his bare hands. Another claimed that the monster feasted on children when the moon was full. And laughter followed, and he felt a pang of annoyance at the grotesque embellishments. But he also noted that even the most frightening stories included admiration for his strength and effectiveness. And he chose to let the lies slide, focusing instead on ensuring that truth would eventually outshine them. Near the docks, a group of children were playing a game, chasing each other with sticks and makeshift wings fashioned from burlap, and one child, standing on a barrel, declared herself the monster hero and instructed the others to pretend to be shadow beasts. And she leaped down with a dramatic roar, scattering her friends, and he watched, hidden behind a stack of crates, with a mix of amusement and unease. Because while it was endearing to see their imaginative play, it also underscored the responsibility he bore, knowing that his actions influenced how the next generation would define courage and justice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in twilight, an elderly storyteller set up a stool near the market and began reciting tales of the sea, and people gathered, drawn by his soothing voice. And eventually he shifted into a tale about a man who had been wronged by those he served, and who had risen above his bitterness to become a protector of all, human and monster alike. And though the storyteller never named him explicitly, the parallels were clear. And he felt a flush of humility and gratitude, because here was a narrative that captured the essence of his struggle, stripped of sensationalism. And after the tale, he approached the storyteller and thanked him quietly. And the old man smiled, saying that stories were tools for understanding, and that it was up to those who lived them to ensure they were worth telling.
8.
Midnight came, and he and Lysandra made their way back to the lighthouse. The town quiet, but for the distant crashing of waves and the occasional creak of ships in the harbor. And they descended a hidden path to the cavern beneath the cliffs, where chanting echoed off damp stone walls, the voices rising and falling in a ritual cadence. And they saw robed figures surrounding a pool of seawater that glowed an unnatural green. Their hands raised and dark shapes writhed just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed, and he felt the seed in his pouch pulse urgently. And he gripped it, feeling its warmth spread up his arm, and Lysandra nodded to him, shadows gathering around her feet in anticipation. And together they stepped into the cavern, the air thick with the scent of salt and sorcery. And at their intrusion, the chanting faltered, and the cult leader raised his hands to summon the creature prematurely. But he was too late. The hero hurled the seed into the pool, its pure energy bursting forth in blinding light that filled the cavern like sunlight underwater, and the dark shapes shrieked and evaporated, the ritual circle cracking apart, and Lysandra's shadows darted through the cultists, binding them before they could flee, and the cavern fell silent, except for the hiss of cleansing magic dissipating. When they emerged from the cave and climbed back up to the lighthouse, the town had awakened, drawn by the tremors and the strange light that had briefly illuminated the cliffs. And the townspeople gathered at a distance, watching warily as he and Lysandra dragged the cultists into the open. And whispers rippled through the crowd, fear mingling with relief. And then the fisherwoman from earlier stepped forward, her hands clasped, and she thanked them loudly, calling him the guardian of both sea and land. And others joined some clapping, hesitantly others bowing their heads, and he saw in their faces a shift, a recognition that whatever rumors they had heard, his deeds tonight had protected their homes and livelihoods. And he felt a knot loosen within him, because while not all suspicion vanished, seeds of respect had been sown. Later, as he and Lysandra sat on a quiet stretch of beach, the waves lapping gently at the shore, he reflected on the power of stories and how quickly they could change. How the exaggerated ballads and dark whispers might now be tempered by eyewitness accounts of his actions, and he realized that, while he could not control every narrative, he could influence them by living in accordance with his values, by ensuring that each rumor carried at its core a kernel of truth about his compassion and his purpose. And he smiled, watching the moonlight dance on the water, and he vowed to continue shaping his legend through deeds rather than words, trusting that over time fear would turn to respect, and legends would evolve into something closer to the reality he was striving to create. After the victory at the coastal town, as grateful villagers resumed their routines and rumors adjusted to incorporate new truths, he and Lysandra turned their attention to the system's cryptic hints about a hidden temple, believing it might hold answers to questions that had been simmering since the day the prompt had changed his life. And they traveled inland, following a winding river that cut through rolling hills and dense forests. And along the way, the system began to send him unusual notifications, not quests or skills, but abstract phrases like equilibrium of light and shadow and seek the roots of your power. And these messages felt less like commands and more like guidance. And he shared them with Lysandra, who suggested that perhaps the system was more than a passive tool. Perhaps it possessed a form of awareness, and he pondered that possibility, feeling both curiosity and caution. Their path eventually led them to an overgrown valley, where moss-covered pillars jutted from the ground like the bones of some ancient beast. And at the center of the valley stood an enormous stone door carved with symbols that matched those on his palm. Symbols that glowed faintly as he approached, resonating with the energy of the system. And when he pressed his hand to the door, it rumbled and slid open, revealing a staircase that descended into the earth. The air inside cool and dry, and without a word he and Lysandra entered, torches flaring to life along the walls as if sensing their presence. And the steps carried them down into a vast chamber illuminated by a soft, ambient light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere. And in the center stood a pedestal upon which rested a crystalline orb pulsing with a gentle glow. As they approached the pedestal, a figure coalesced from the light, neither solid nor ethereal, with features that shifted between masculine and feminine, human and monstrous. And when it spoke, its voice echoed with multiple tones, as though many beings spoke in unison, and it greeted them by name, stating that it was an avatar of the system, a manifestation designed to interact with those seeking understanding, and it explained that this temple had been constructed long ago by mages, who sought to create a conduit for power that would not be tied to any one race or kingdom, a mechanism that would respond to the values and choices of those who used it, and that the system itself was not sentient in the way a person was, but it was not entirely inert either. It was a complex set of rules and algorithms infused with magic, designed to adapt and evolve based on the input it received. The avatar then presented them with a challenge, stating that the system's neutrality meant it required those who wielded its power to demonstrate balance and self-awareness, and it conjured three apparitions before them: a sobbing child clutching a loaf of bread, a snarling wolf with a wounded paw, and a hooded assassin sharpening a dagger, and it asked them to decide who was in the most urgent need of assistance. And he felt the weight of the decision. Knowing that each represented a different facet of morality, innocence, suffering, and intent, he turned to Lysandra, discussing their options. And together, they concluded that the wolf, though dangerous, was in immediate pain and could not help itself, while the child could be fed and the assassin could choose his path. And so he approached the wolf, using his healing skill to mend its paw, and the wolf transformed into a radiant being that bowed in gratitude, while the child and the assassin smiled and vanished, revealing that this was a test of prioritizing empathy over fear or prejudice. Satisfied with their answer, the avatar gestured, and the chamber shifted, walls dissolving into scenes of the past projected around them, images of heroes standing at crossroads similar to his own, some who chose humanity and became venerated leaders, others who embraced monstrosity and saved villages from dragons, and a few who succumbed to their darker impulses, using the system's power to conquer and oppress. And the avatar explained that the system itself had no moral compass. It provided tools, and the outcomes depended on the user's values, and it showed them how in one era a hero had used the system to enforce a brutal regime, twisting its capabilities into mind control, and how in another, a monster had harnessed its gifts to unite warring tribes, proving that power itself was neutral, and that the system merely amplified what already existed within the heart. He watched these projections with a mix of fascination and unease, seeing reflections of his own choices and potential futures. and he asked the avatar if the system could ever refuse to empower someone unworthy, and the avatar responded that the system's design did not judge worthiness, but rather responded to inputs with corresponding outputs. It was a mirror and an amplifier, and if darkness within a user grew, the system would offer skills that complemented that darkness, while if compassion grew, it would respond in kind. In this revelation relieved him because it meant the system was not manipulating him toward evil or good, but it also sobered him because it underscored the importance of his internal discipline, of maintaining his moral compass, since the system would follow where he led. Lysandra asked whether the system served anyone else, whether there were other champions in distant lands. And the avatar confirmed that there were multiple iterations of the system scattered across the world, each connected yet independent, and that sometimes their users' actions rippled into one another's lives, causing alliances or conflicts, and that occasionally two system bearers would cross paths, testing their values against each other's, and he felt a surge of interest and apprehension, realizing that his journey might not remain confined to his region, and he wondered what it would be like to meet another who understood the weight of the system, perhaps with values vastly different from his own. The avatar offered them an opportunity to deepen their connection with the system, presenting a choice of enhancements, one that would greatly increase their raw power at the cost of magnifying their emotions, and another that would expand their perception, allowing them to sense the intentions of those around them. And without hesitation, he chose the latter, valuing insight over strength, because he had learned that understanding could prevent conflicts before they escalated. And Lysandra chose the same, their choices aligning, and when the enhancements were bestowed, he felt a subtle shift, a new layer of awareness that tingled at the edge of his consciousness, like a faint resonance that varied depending on who he was near, and he thanked the avatar, feeling grateful for the ability to better navigate the complex moral landscape ahead. The avatar issued a warning. Dark mages had discovered fragments of the system's underlying magic, and were attempting to create their own twisted versions. Seeds of corruption that could subvert the system's neutrality and force users along specific paths of destruction, and the avatar urged them to seek out and neutralize these corrupted seeds whenever they encountered them, using the ancient seeds Silvaria had given him to purify them, and the gravity of this task settled upon him because it meant that his mission extended beyond his personal journey. He was now a guardian of the system itself, a protector of the balance between its potential for good and evil. As they ascended the stairs back to the surface, the chamber faded behind them, and the door slid shut, blending seamlessly into the landscape, and he and Lysandra emerged into the sunlight, blinking, feeling the warmth on their faces. And he looked at his hand at the symbol that marked him as a system user, and he felt a newfound respect for it, seeing it not as a mark of destiny, but as a reminder of the choices he carried and he shared. With Lysandra, his sense of relief that the system was not an unseen puppet master, but a neutral mechanism responding to his values. And she nodded, saying that knowledge was empowering, that understanding the nature of their power made it easier to wield responsibly. They continued their journey, the landscape stretching out before them, and he found himself testing his new perceptive ability, focusing on the subtle vibrations he felt around strangers. Noticing that fear buzzed like a low hum, that trust felt like a steady rhythm, and that malice pulsed sharply, and he marveled at how this insight could help him navigate interactions, allowing him to address underlying emotions rather than reacting to surface words. And he thanked the system silently for offering such a gift, acknowledging that its neutrality did not preclude it from being benevolent. That night, as they camped beneath a clear sky streaked with shooting stars, he reflected on the revelations of the day, on the origins of the system and its true nature, and he felt a sense of empowerment and accountability intertwine, because now he knew that the system would follow his lead, magnifying whatever lay within him. And he resolved to cultivate empathy, restraint, and courage to ensure that the power he wielded would be used to heal and protect. And as he drifted off to sleep, the system sent him one final message for the day. Equilibrium achieved. Continue evolving, and he smiled in his half-conscious state, comforted by the knowledge that his path, though fraught with challenges, was also filled with growth and discovery. Asked ChatGPT. Emerging from the temple with the system's origins and neutrality firmly etched into his mind, He spent the next days walking in contemplative silence, the landscape shifting from rolling hills to dense forest and back again as he turned over the lessons he had learned. And in the quiet, he began to articulate a personal code, a set of principles to guide his use of power now that he knew the system would amplify whatever lay within him. And he shared these thoughts with Lysandra by the light of their evening fire, saying that he wanted to be deliberate about his choices. He wanted to formalize his instincts into vows, so that when temptation whispered, he could remind himself of his own promises. And she listened intently, nodding as he spoke of mercy balanced with justice, of restraint balanced with decisiveness, of protecting those who could not protect themselves without imposing his will unnecessarily, and together they debated the nuances, her perspectives sharpening his, until their conversation shaped the framework of what he would henceforth refer to as the Monster's Code not long after. Their resolve was tested when they stumbled upon a village reduced to ashes, smoke still curling from charred beams, the stench of burnt wood and spilled blood heavy in the air, and among the ruins a few survivors knelt, their faces streaked with soot and tears, and when they saw him and Lysandra, they rose, a mix of hope and anger in their eyes, and they told of a band of marauders who had swept through, taking what little they had and burning the rest of children, taken and elders slain, and they begged him to hunt down the perpetrators and exact revenge. And he felt the familiar flare of anger ignite within him at the injustice, but he also felt the weight of his new code settle on his shoulders, reminding him that vengeance taken without understanding could perpetuate cycles of violence, and he promised the villagers he would act. But he would act according to his principles, seeking to protect and restore rather than to satiate blind rage. He and Lysandra set out to track the marauders moving through the forest with silent purpose, and he used his new perceptive ability to sense the emotional residues left on the ground, faint echoes of fear and aggression that led them to a hidden encampment nestled between two rocky outcrops. And from the cover of the trees, he observed the group, noting that among the hardened criminals were a handful of youths whose body language vibrated with reluctance and anxiety. And he sensed malice in some and desperation in others. He realized that not all within the band were equally culpable. And this insight tempered his approach, solidifying his decision to differentiate between those driven by cruelty and those driven by circumstance when he confronted them. Stepping into the encampment, he announced his presence, wings flaring slightly to command attention, and the bandits scrambled to their feet. Weapons drawn, curses spilling from their lips, and at their center stood the leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek. As their eyes met, recognition flickered between them, because this was a former soldier who had once served under his command, a man who had fought bravely in battles against demons, but who now led raiders against farmers, and the bitterness in the man's voice as he spoke of being abandoned by the kingdom, of watching his family starve while nobles feasted, cut through him, because it mirrored the betrayal he himself had felt, and he felt his anger sharpen, not just at the leader's actions, but at the circumstances that had driven him here. They exchanged words that were heavy with shared history and divergent choices, the leader accusing him of forgetting his own people, of turning into something unrecognizable, and he countered that desperation did not justify harming innocents. There were other ways to survive, and he offered the bandits a choice: lay down their arms, return what they had taken, and come with him to rebuild the village they had destroyed, or face the consequences of further violence. And he promised that those who chose mercy would find mercy, while those who chose violence would face swift justice. And he saw some of the men glance at one another, uncertainty rippling through the group, and slowly several weapons clattered to the ground, including those of the reluctant youths, while a smaller contingent tightened their grips, eyes narrowing with defiance. A fight ensued with those who refused to surrender, brief and intense, and he and Lysandra moved with precision, incapacitating rather than killing whenever possible, breaking swords, sweeping legs, binding arms, and when the dust settled, 3 of the bandits lay unconscious, their injuries severe but not fatal, and the rest knelt with hands behind their heads, and he instructed them to gather the stolen supplies and lead the way back to the village. And he appointed the former soldier leader to carry the heaviest load, telling him that this was the first step in atonement. Not a full redemption, but a beginning, and as they walked, he spoke to those who had been coerced into banditry, offering them alternatives, pledging to help them find honest work. Once the village was rebuilt and he felt the threads of his code weave through his actions, guiding him toward balance between punishment and compassion. Back in the village, he oversaw the return of the goods and the rebuilding efforts, his claws lifting beams into place, his wings shading workers from the sun as they toiled, and he kept a watchful eye on the former bandits, who were now under the scrutiny of those they had wronged. And he saw in the villagers' eyes a complex mix of anger, gratitude, and suspicion. And he knew that trust would not be immediate. But he hoped that his decision to bring the perpetrators back to repair the damage they had done would plant seeds of healing, rather than seeds of further hatred. And as the day progressed, he gathered the survivors and the bandits and spoke aloud the code he had been forming, declaring that he would not tolerate harm to the innocent, that he would temper justice with mercy, that he would judge individuals by their actions and circumstances, and that he would not allow himself to become a tyrant under the guise of protector. And his words carried weight not only for those around him, but for himself, solidifying his vows. Later, as the sun set and the day's labor wound down, he and Lysandra sat on a partially rebuilt porch, their hands rough and their backs sore, and they reflected on how the code had held up under pressure, and she shared her own. Guiding principles which centered on freedom of choice, personal responsibility, and the rejection of systems that demanded blind obedience, and they found that their codes, while different, intersected in crucial ways, both emphasizing empathy, justice, and autonomy. And they agreed to hold each other accountable to their principles, knowing that power could blur lines if left unchecked. And he felt a sense of solace in this mutual accountability, because it meant that his code was not just an internal compass, but a shared ethos that could be strengthened through dialogue and support. Not long after, they were tested again when a large, scaly beast burst from the forest, eyes wild and stomach sunken, its ribs visible beneath its tough hide, and villagers screamed, scrambling for weapons. And instinctively he moved to intercept, but as he approached, his perceptive ability revealed not malice, but hunger, a throbbing desperation emanating from the creature. And he realized that it was not attacking out of aggression, but out of starvation, likely driven from its territory by human encroachment or dark magic. And instead of attacking, he called to the villagers to hold their arrows. And he used his empathy to communicate calm to the beast, lending it to a pile of refuse where scraps of food were discarded, and it ate greedily before lumbering back into the forest. And he instructed the villagers to place food at the edge of the woods until they could find a longer-term solution. And in this act, he saw his code in action, protecting his people while recognizing the complexities of other beings' actions. As he lay in his bedroll that night, the sounds of rebuilding and cautious laughter filtering through the air, he thought about the balance between vengeance and mercy, about how easy it would have been to kill the bandits or the beast and be hailed as a hero, and how much harder it was to choose the path that sought rehabilitation and understanding. And he realized that his code would often put him at odds with both monsters and humans who preferred simpler solutions, and he accepted that difficulty because he believed that true strength lay in choosing the harder path when it was right, even if it cost him praise or made him an enemy. And he felt a calm settle over him, a steadying assurance that he was forging a path that honored both the hero and the monster within him. The system acknowledged his commitment, sending him a notification that read, "New title earned, Arbiter of Shadows and Light," and it offered him the choice to accept or decline it, noting that accepting would signal to others who could sense such things that he had chosen a path of balance, while declining would keep his status ambiguous, and he considered the implications, weighing the usefulness of a title that conveyed his intentions against the possibility of painting a target on his back. And he decided to accept not for vanity, but because he believed that transparency about his code could inspire those who sought someone to emulate, and deter those who might assume he would act without restraint. And as he accepted, he felt a subtle shift, a new resonance, and he knew that his commitment to balance was now recognized by the system itself. As the village fell into a tentative peace and the stars wheeled overhead, he stood at the edge of the rebuilt square, looking out at the dark forest beyond and the flickering lights within? And he whispered his code to the night, reaffirming his vows, and he felt the weight and freedom of them settle into his bones. And he turned back toward Lysandra, who waited with a small smile, and together they set off toward their next destination. The path ahead uncertain, but his moral compass now firmly set, guiding him through the gray areas with the knowledge that mercy and justice were not mutually exclusive, and that he could be a monster by form and a guardian by choice, crafting a legacy that would, he hoped, outlast even the most persistent of rumors. Word traveled like wind across plains and through forests, and soon after solidifying his code. He heard rumors from merchants and travelers that the council, unsettled by the stories of his continued influence and the success of his interventions, had commissioned a new cadre of heroes to apprehend or eliminate him, and part of him felt a pang of sorrow at the thought that the mantle he had once worn was now weaponized against him, while another part braced for the confrontation, not out of fear, but because he knew it would test the very principles he had set for himself. And Lysandra, hearing the rumors, placed a hand on his shoulder and asked if he was ready to face those he had once called brothers and sisters. And he nodded, the weight of inevitability settling in his bones, because avoiding them would only prolong the conflict. And he had resolved to face challenges head-on, with clarity and compassion. Their paths converged in a grassy clearing, surrounded by towering oaks where sunlight filtered through the leaves. And as he and Lysandra stepped into the open, figures emerged from the trees opposite them, clad in armor marked with the insignia of the Special Class Division, weapons glinting, and his breath caught when he recognized familiar faces. Joran, whose laughter had once been louder than life itself, now held a spear leveled at his chest. His jaw set, and Mira, whose arrows had saved him countless times, stood a pace behind, her bow drawn, but not yet aimed, her eyes flickering between him and their leader. And behind them stood two younger warriors, whose expressions were a mixture of determination and apprehension, and for a heartbeat. The clearing felt suspended in time, past and present, colliding in a moment loaded with memory and menace. Joran's voice cut through the silence, thick with accusation, as he called him a traitor to the kingdom, to their comrades who had fallen believing in the system, and his words were sharp and bitter, laced with hurt and anger, and the hero felt each word as if it were a blade, because he had thought their bond unbreakable. Forged in the fires of battle and strengthened in moments of vulnerability, yet now that bond was stretched to its thinnest, and he saw in Joran's eyes not hatred alone but fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of the council's wrath should he hesitate, and Mira's eyes, in contrast, held conflict. Mirroring his own turmoil, and he raised his hands in a gesture of peace, feeling the eyes of Lysandra on him, ready to respond, should words fail. He spoke plainly, his voice carrying across the clearing without the aid of magic or intimidation, and he told them of the council's betrayal, of the system's neutrality, of the dark mages manipulating fear, and he shared his code, explaining that he had chosen his path not out of spite, but out of a deep sense of justice that could not be contained within the kingdom's walls. And he asked them to recall the moments they had fought side by side, when they had saved lives not because of orders but because it was right. And he pleaded with them to look beyond the rhetoric they had been fed, to see him as the man they had once known. And he could see Mira's grip on her bow loosen slightly, hope flickering, but Joran shook his head, his muscles tensing, and he shouted that talk would not absolve betrayal. That orders were orders, and he charged, spear aimed straight for the heart. The spearhead glinted as it thrust toward him, and he pivoted, avoiding the point by inches, grabbing the shaft and twisting to deflect Joran's momentum, and the fight began, intense and swift, with Lysandra moving to intercept the younger warriors who rushed forward, her shadows wrapping around their ankles, her daggers parrying blades with such finesse that no blood was drawn, while he faced Joran's fury, meeting each strike with a defensive maneuver, refusing to retaliate with lethal force, using his claws to bat away weapons, his tail to trip, his wings to create gusts that unbalanced his opponents. And throughout he spoke Joran's name, reminding him of memories, of laughter, of nights spent around campfires dreaming of peace. Hoping that somewhere beneath the anger, the man he knew still listened. Mira watched, her brow furrowed, arrow knocked but not loosed, and he sensed her inner battle. the pull of loyalty to the council clashing with memories of trust. And as he fought, he used his new perceptive ability to sense the emotions around him, feeling Joran's rage spike with frustration each time a blow was turned aside. He was feeling the fear and confusion of the younger warriors trapped in Lysandra's shadows, and feeling Mira's heartbeat quicken, not with aggression but with indecision. Yes. And at a critical moment, when Lysandra disarmed one of the youths who then cowered, eyes wide, Myra lowered her bow, letting the arrow point toward the ground, and she called out Joran's name, her voice carrying a plea. And Joran faltered for a fraction of a second, and he seized the opportunity to disarm him, knocking the spear aside and grasping Joran's wrist, forcing him to his knees without causing harm. Breathing heavily, Joran glared up at him, chest heaving sweat, streaking his face, and he held his former comrade's gaze, seeing the stubborn pride and hurt reflected back, and he spoke softly, telling Joran that he did not wish to fight him, that his path had diverged not because he had turned his back on their ideals, but because he believed those ideals could not thrive under the council's corruption. And he repeated his offer: lay down arms, seek truth, and fight for justice rather than orders. And beside them, Lysandra released the shadows binding the younger warriors, who scrambled back but did not flee. And Mira stepped forward, placing a hand on Joran's shoulder, her eyes meeting his, where she said that the rumors and orders did not match the man she saw before her, that perhaps they should listen rather than attack. And Joran's jaw clenched, but slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his head, the fight draining from his limbs. They moved to the shade of an oak and spoke, the tension easing, but not dissipating. And Myra revealed that the council had told them the monster hero was corrupting villages, turning them against the kingdom, and that he sought to raise an army of monsters to overthrow the human world. And hearing these lies laid bare, deepened his understanding of the fear that fueled the council's actions, and he countered with truths of his own, sharing what he had learned about the system's origins and neutrality, about the dark cult manipulating shadows, about the villagers and monsters he had saved. And he did not try to sugarcoat his transformation or his anger, acknowledging that he had changed and that he could not return to the role the council wanted of him. And they listened, Myra with an open mind, Joran with arms crossed and eyes wary, but he saw seeds of doubt plant themselves in his former friend's stance. When they finally rose to leave, he untied the younger warriors and handed them back their weapons. But first, and he told them that if they returned to the council, they would likely be commanded to hunt him again, but if they chose to seek truth for themselves, they could travel to the villages he had helped and speak to those who had witnessed his deeds. And Myra said she would take that path, promising to return with news if she could, while Joran, though still conflicted, remained silent, and he clasped Joran's forearm, not as a captor but as a brother, and he whispered that forgiveness was available, that hatred would poison him more than any monster. And Joran's grip tightened briefly before he pulled away, and they left him standing in the clearing, gaze fixed on the ground. Lysandra watched the exchange with a mixture of approval and concern, and once they were out of earshot, she remarked that he could not save everyone, that some hearts would remain hardened no matter how many chances he offered, and he nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. But he also stated that he would not cease trying, his bet, because abandoning hope would make him no better than those who followed orders without question, and she smiled faintly, saying that his stubborn optimism was one of the things she admired most, even if it sometimes made her shake her head. And they walked in silence for a while, each processing the encounter, the forest around them alive with birdsong and the distant rustle of creatures in the underbrush. He reflected on the loss and potential recovery of friendships, on how shared experiences could be eroded by fear and manipulated by those in power, and he felt a pang of grief for the camaraderie that had been strained. But he also felt a spark of hope in Myra's choice, in Joran's faltering grip, and the possibility that truth could, over time, pierce through propaganda. And he resolved to continue living in a way that would provide evidence for those who doubted, to let his actions testify to his code and his humanity. And he silently sent a wish toward Joran, hoping that the man he knew still existed beneath the anger, that he would eventually see the light and perhaps even join him in the fight against true corruption. As they resumed their journey, leaving the clearing and their past behind, the trees opened to reveal a distant horizon where smoke rose in thick plumes, and travelers fleeing the direction of the capital spoke breathlessly of a massive demon horde descending upon the kingdom, of walls trembling and citizens fleeing, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Because this was not just another skirmish, but the beginning of something greater, perhaps the siege he had always feared. And he turned to Lysandra, their eyes meeting, and without words they knew their path now led back toward the heart of the kingdom. Not to seek acceptance, but to defend those who would otherwise be defenseless. To uphold his code even when those he saved might still see him as the enemy, and with that realization fueling their steps. They moved with renewed urgency toward the rising smoke. ChatGPT. The sight of smoke rising from the horizon, coupled with the frantic accounts of refugees fleeing the capital, ignited a sense of urgency within him, and yet, as he and Lysandra quickened their pace, he realized that confronting a demon horde would require more than their own strength and the wavering support of humans who still distrusted him. And his mind leaped back to Silvaria's mention of ancient pacts and hidden kingdoms, of alliances between monsters and humans that had once been forged to withstand threats greater than any single race could face. And he decided that before heading directly into the siege, they would seek out these hidden realms, not to beg, but to rebuild the bridges that fear and greed had broken, because he believed that a unified stand monsters, humans, spirits would be stronger than any army the council could muster alone. Their first destination lay beneath the mountains to the north, in caverns where, according to legend, a kingdom of stone-skinned beings known as the Carrick had forged weapons of unparalleled strength and had once sealed a rift that spewed demons into the world. And guided by fragments of old maps and the system's subtle nudges, they trekked through jagged passes and along narrow ledges, until they found a seam in the rock where fresh air flowed from deep within. And they squeezed through, emerging into a vast subterranean hall where the walls glittered with veins of crystal and the air hummed with the low, rhythmic pounding of hammers, and as they stepped forward, figures emerged from the shadows their skin.
Oh, the color of granite.
Their eyes glowing softly, and they crossed their arms over their chests in a gesture that was both defensive and respectful. And in their tongue they asked why surface dwellers dared enter their domain. He bowed, spreading his wings behind him in what he hoped they would recognize as a display of honesty, no weapons drawn. Nothing to hide, and he spoke of the threat looming above, of the demons that would not discriminate between stone and flesh, and he spoke of the monster-esque code, and of his desire to unite those who had been divided. And his words were translated by an elderly Carrick woman whose deep voice echoed off the cavern walls, and murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, some doubtful, others intrigued. And then a tall figure stepped forward, his beard braided with metal beads, his arms scarred from centuries of forging, and he introduced himself as Thuric, the Stone King. And he said that the Carrick remembered a time when humans and monsters stood shoulder to shoulder, but that memory had been soured by betrayals, and that if he wished to earn their aid, he would need to undergo a trial of trust. Thuric led them deeper into the caves, through tunnels lit by glowing fungi, till they reached a chamber where a massive forge lay cold, its coals long extinguished, and above it hung a great hammer that, according to Thuric, had been wielded by the last human hero who had proven himself to the Carrick. The trial was simple in description but heavy in implication. You must strike the forge with the hammer and reignite its fire without causing harm or damage to the surrounding cavern, a test of strength tempered by control. And he grasped the hammer, feeling its weight in his hands, and he closed his eyes, recalling his code, channeling his power not as an explosion, but as a steady flow. And when the hammer met the anvil, the sound rang pure, reverberating through the stone, and a small flame flickered, then grew fed by his controlled energy, until the forge glowed red, and he set the hammer down gently, the fire burning steadily, and Thuric nodded in approval, saying that restraint and power in equal measure were what the Carrick valued most. Acknowledging his success, Thuric agreed to send a contingent of Carrick warriors to aid in the defense of the capital, but he warned that the humans would need to accept their presence, that any insult or attack against his people would result in their immediate withdrawal. And he looked the hero in the eyes and said that he trusted him to uphold his code not just with enemies, but with allies as well, and he agreed, feeling the weight of responsibility increase. because he understood that bringing together old allies required vigilance to prevent old wounds from reopening. And he promised Theric that he would do everything in his power to ensure cooperation, and they clasped forearms, sealing the pact.
Ouch.
Leaving the Mountain Kingdom with the promise of aid secured, they traveled next to the marshlands to the south, where rumors told of water spirits Meridians who controlled tides and could drown entire armies if provoked. And there he discovered that communication was more difficult, because the Meridians spoke in currents and ripples rather than words, and Lysandra used her shadow magic to write in the water while he projected emotions through his empathy. And together, they conveyed the urgency of the demon threat and their intention to respect the waters. And slowly, shimmering forms rose from the depths. Their bodies fluid and ever-changing, and their leader, a being named Nerissa, extended a tendril of water that wrapped around his wrist, testing his calm, and upon sensing his sincerity, she agreed to swell the riverbanks near the capital to create natural moats that would hinder demon movement, provided that humans promised not to pollute their waters afterwards, and he nodded, understanding that alliances came with accountability. Continuing their circuit of the hidden realms, they ventured east into a forest of towering bamboo, where the air was thick with pollen and the ground soft with moss, and there they encountered the sylphid-winged creatures no larger than children whose laughter sounded like wind chimes, and these beings had once carried messages between human kingdoms before being hunted for their shimmering wings, and they were understandably wary, flitting between branches and hurling seeds and curses. But he and Lysandra sat upon a log and sang an old marching song softly, one that the sylphid had taught him long ago to boost morale during a siege. And hearing the familiar tune, one of the sylphid hovered closer, her wings beating rapidly, and she asked if he remembered their friendship, and he nodded, tears pricking his eyes. And he apologized for humanity's betrayal, and he asked for their help, not out of obligation, but out of shared history. And after a long pause, the Sylphid Queen descended and offered to carry messages and scout the demon horde's movements, but she insisted on no arrowheads tipped with poison or nets hung in the treetops in return, and he agreed, adding to his growing list of promises. In each hidden kingdom they visited, whether among the fiery salamanders beneath volcanoes, or the enigmatic Shadowcats in caves of perpetual twilight, the pattern repeated: suspicion tempered by curiosity, trials that tested their intentions, negotiations that balanced immediate necessity with long-term respect, and with each successful alliance, he felt his confidence grow, not in his power to command, but in his ability to build trust across divides. And he also felt humbled by the diversity of cultures and powers that had existed alongside humanity, often unnoticed or intentionally forgotten. And he recorded their customs and conditions in a small journal for future reference, because he understood that maintaining alliances would require honoring these agreements beyond the current crisis. In one ancient underground library of the salamanders, carved into obsidian walls and lit by lava flows, he discovered a brittle scroll sealed within a stone tube. And upon carefully unrolling it, he found diagrams and incantations describing an artifact called the Heartfire Lantern, relic that, when lit with a pure flame, could create a barrier that demons could not cross. And the scroll mentioned that the lantern had been lost during the last great demon invasion, buried somewhere beneath the capital itself, and his heart raced at the revelation, because securing such an artifact could turn the tide of the impending siege. And he shared the information with Lysandra, who traced the ancient script with her fingers, her eyes widening. They both knew that recovering the lantern would be a dangerous but potentially decisive mission. As they made their way back toward human lands with their entourage of allies, he felt time pressing against his skin like a physical force, because each day they spent away from the capital was a day that walls were battered and lives were lost, and he grappled with the tension between gathering aid and arriving in time to matter, and Lysandra, sensing his anxiety, reminded him that their allies would mean little if no one knew how to coordinate them upon arrival, and she suggested that he send the Sylphid ahead with messages to any human leaders still willing to listen, outlining the alliances they were bringing and the conditions attached, and he agreed, trusting that Mira, if she had reached any understanding, might help sway minds upon receipt. As they emerged from the forests and mountains accompanied by Karak warriors whose footsteps shook the ground, by Meridians who traveled in rivulets and streams alongside the road by Sylphid, flitting overhead carrying missives, and by salamanders who crackled with heat beneath their rocky armor, he felt a swell of hope despite the dark plumes staining the sky ahead. Because this coalition, improbable as it was, represented the very essence of what he had been striving for: unity through respect, strength through diversity, power tempered by compassion and mutual agreements. And he marveled at the fact that his code and his sincerity had been enough to convince beings who had every reason to distrust humans to stand beside them in battle. As the capital's outer farms came into view, fields trampled and abandoned, and the distant roar of battle reached their ears, he paused atop a small hill, looking over the ragtag army of humans and monsters at his back, and he felt the burden of leadership settle fully upon him. But he also felt the solid grounding of his code under his feet and the warmth of the ancient seed at his. Beltany spoke to the assembled allies, his voice carrying across the wind, reminding them of their promises to one another, of the lives depending on their cooperation, and of the opportunity to forge a new chapter where monsters and humans fought together. And as they roared their approval, he turned toward the besieged city, ready to step once more into the fray, not as humanity's weapon, or as a lone monster, but as the bridge he had vowed to be. Upon cresting the hill and taking in the battered outskirts of the capital fields, churned to mud, homes abandoned, and smoke rising from breaches in the outer walls, he realized that their first priority was to organize the disparate allies who had followed him into a cohesive force. And so he selected a ruined granary on the city's edge that still offered shelter and assembled within it the leaders of each group. Tharik of the Karik, his granite brow furrowed. Nerissa the Meridian, her water form contained within a barrel that shimmered with captured river water. Sylphid Queen perched lightly on a broken beam. The Salamander Elder, heat radiating gently from his rocky skin. And Mira, who had returned ahead of them with word from within the city, standing as a bridge to the human commanders, who watched from the doorway with wary eyes, and Lysandra at his side, the shadow spirit swirling at her feet. And as the last of them settled, he felt the weight of expectation settle on his shoulders, because he knew that what they decided here would shape not just the coming battle, but the potential for a new order. He opened the council by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of their assembly. Humans and monsters, sitting together under one roof without weapons drawn, he expressed gratitude for their willingness to set aside centuries of mistrust. And then he laid out the stakes. A demon horde unlike any they had faced before, empowered by dark magic that could overwhelm the city's defenses unless they acted in concert. And he reminded them that victory could not be achieved by any one group alone. And he emphasized his code as the foundation for their cooperation: respect, restraint, and justice. And he proposed that they establish a council, temporarily at first, to coordinate their efforts, with representatives from each faction having equal say, and he promised that their unique conditions would be honored, that no agreement would be coerced, and he looked to each leader in turn, waiting for their response. Tharik was the first to speak, his voice like stones grinding together. He said that the Karik would lend their strength to reinforce the city's walls, to forge weapons and armor that could withstand demon claws. But he reiterated that any insult or betrayal from humans would see their hammers turned inward, and Nerissa followed, her voice gurgling like a stream, declaring that the Meridians would flood the moats and create currents to hinder demon advance. But she warned that if humans polluted the waters with corpses or waste, the rivers would recede from the city and leave it vulnerable. And the Sylphid Queen chimed in, her voice tinkling like bells, offering to fly reconnaissance and relay messages swiftly, but only if humans agreed to cease capturing her people for their wings. And the Salamander Elder promised to channel fire into controlled bursts to burn demons without consuming human structures, provided humans stopped mining the volcanoes without permission. And as each spoke, the human commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain Rowan, shifted uneasily, but held his tongue. Captain Rowan eventually cleared his throat and spoke, his tone wary but respectful, saying that the city was desperate and in no position to refuse aid, but he admitted that his men were unaccustomed to fighting alongside monsters. And he expressed concern about discipline and communication. And he asked how he could be sure that these creatures would not turn on them in the chaos. And he looked directly at the hero, his eyes hard. And the hero met his gaze and replied that trust would have to be earned on both sides, and that the code he had shared would apply to all, human and monster alike. And he proposed joint patrols with mixed units, training exercises before the main assault to build familiarity, and liaison officers from each group to prevent misunderstandings. Enlil offered to share command with Rowan under the council's oversight, ensuring no single entity held unchecked authority. The suggestion sparked murmurs, and Mira stepped forward, lending her voice to support the proposal, recounting her own experience of being misled by the council and subsequently choosing to see with her own eyes. And she urged her fellow humans to set aside preconceptions and judge their allies by their actions. And Lysandra added that the monsters gathered here had as much to lose as the humans, because the demon horde would not stop at the city walls, and that cooperation now could forge bonds that would outlast the crisis. And slowly, the tension in the room eased. And Captain Rowan nodded reluctantly, saying that while he could not speak for all his men, he would commit to the council and encourage others to do the same, and the human commanders behind him murmured assent. With the framework agreed upon, the council turned to strategy, and Theric proposed creating layered defenses. Karic engineers would reinforce the walls and build barricades. Humans would man ballistae. Meridians would flood select streets to funnel demons into kill zones. Salamanders would ignite oil traps at key points, and Sylphid would relay real-time information. And they mapped the city's layout on the granary floor using stones and sticks, assigning units to sectors, planning retreats and counterattacks, and he listened to each suggestion, ensuring that no voice dominated and that all concerns were addressed. And when disputes arose, such as where to place water channels to avoid flooding, Holmesy mediated, seeking compromise, and his perceptive ability allowed him to sense when frustration flared, enabling him to intervene before conflicts escalated, and by the time the council adjourned, a cohesive plan had been crafted. One that leveraged the strengths of each faction while honoring their boundaries. However, the council also touched upon matters beyond the immediate battle. And Nerissa raised the issue of what would happen after, asking whether the humans would return to their old ways of exploitation once the demons were gone. And Thoric questioned whether the Carrick's help would be acknowledged or erased from history, as had happened before. And the Salamander Elder insisted that any post-war agreements include rights to their territories, and Captain Rowan, to his credit, acknowledged that these were valid concerns. But he admitted that he did not have the authority to promise long-term policy changes on behalf of the council, prompting Mira to suggest that this council, once temporary, could become a permanent advisory body to ensure continued dialogue. And he saw the flicker of possibility in that idea. And he pledged that he would advocate for such a structure, understanding that this battle could be the catalyst for a new order, if they seized the opportunity. As the council dispersed to prepare their forces, he felt the system hum in his mind, a notification appearing that acknowledged his diplomatic success and offered a new skill. Aura of Unity, which, when activated, would bolster the morale of allies within a certain radius and reduce the likelihood of friendly fire, and he accepted it, grateful for any tool that could help maintain cohesion in the chaos to come, and he shared the details with Lysandra, who smiled and remarked that it seemed the system approved of his bridge building. And he resolved to use the aura sparingly, knowing that it would be most needed in the heat of battle. No sooner had the leaders returned to their forces than a roar echoed from the direction of the outer wall, followed by a crash and the sound of stone crumbling, and a runner burst into the granary, panting. Reporting that a section of the wall had been breached, and demons were pouring through, their claws ripping into earth and flesh. And without hesitation, he activated the Aura of Unity, feeling a warm pulse emanate from his chest, spreading outward, and he dashed toward the breach, Lysandra at his side, the allied forces falling into formation as planned. Carrick forming a living wall of stone and steel, humans firing arrows from behind, Meridians sending surging waves to knock demons off balance, salamanders igniting trapped pits, and Sylphid darting overhead, shouting warnings of flanking maneuvers. In the thick of the battle, amid the cacophony of screams and clashes, he saw with relief that the council's preparations held. The demons were slowed by the flooded streets and forced into narrow corridors where their numbers counted for less, and he moved through the chaos like a conductor coordinating with Rowan via a Sylphid messenger, adjusting strategies when unexpected behaviors emerged, such as demons that could swim faster than anticipated or climb walls slick with water. And at one point a young human soldier hesitated to stand beside a salamander warrior, but the aura of unity seemed to calm his nerves. And he raised his shield, and together they repelled a demon that had leaped from a rooftop. And he realized that the aura not only bolstered morale, but also softened prejudices, at least temporarily. As the initial wave was repelled, and the demons regrouped for another assault, he took a brief moment to survey the battlefield. The ground was littered with demon corpses that burned with green fire. But the lines held, and he saw Captain Rowan, slapping a Carrick soldier on the back in camaraderie, and a Meridian tendril lifting a wounded human onto a cart, and a sylphid landing on a salamander's shoulder to whisper intel, and he felt a surge of pride and hope, because this, more than any speech or counsel, was proof that cooperation was possible, and he knew that even if the battle dragged on for days, the seeds planted would grow into something resilient, provided they nurtured them. Night began to fall, casting long shadows across the city, but the fires of battle lit the sky, and as he prepared for the next assault, he glanced back toward the granary and the council within, thinking of the agreements made and the promises exchanged. He whispered to himself that the real war against ignorance, against division, would continue long after the last demon was slain, but that tonight they fought together, beasts and humans united. And he tightened his grip on his sword, feeling the warmth of the ancient seed at his waist and the steady presence of his allies around him, and he stepped forward into the fray, ready to defend not only lives, but the fragile hope of a new order. As ours turned into a day and then another, the battle for the capital stretched on. It's punctuated by bursts of demon assaults and respites for rebuilding and tending to the wounded. And in those moments between clashes, he began to notice a shift in the mood of some of the human defenders, whispers spreading like mildew in damp corners. Rumors that the monster allies intended to seize the city once the demons were vanquished, that the hero who led them sought the crown for himself. And he traced these rumors back to leaflets that had appeared overnight, printed on cheap paper and bearing the council's seal, warning citizens to be vigilant against the monster army and hinting that the demon attacks might be a diversion for a coup. And as he held one of these leaflets in his clawed hand, reading the veiled accusations, he felt a cold anger stir within him. Not because of personal insult, but because such lies threatened to unravel the fragile coalition they had worked so hard to build. Unbeknownst to him initially, within the fortified council chambers deep in the heart of the city, the council members who had orchestrated his exile sat around a polished table, illuminated by flickering candlelight, their faces drawn tight with fear and determination, and they whispered plans to rid themselves of both the demon threat and the uncomfortable alliance of monsters, fearing that if the coalition prevailed, their own power would be diminished. And one counselor proposed collapsing a section of the inner wall when the monsters pushed through, ensuring that they would be crushed between stone and demon, while another suggested luring the hero into the catacombs with promises of negotiation and then sealing him inside with explosives rigged to dark wards. And they agreed that propaganda would soften public resistance to such actions, making the betrayal appear as a necessary sacrifice rather than treachery. It was Myra who first caught wind of the plot, having been assigned to liaise between the human defenders and the coalition. And she overheard a council scribe muttering about timing the wall collapse during the next demon push. And she sought him out between battles, her face pale, and she whispered what she had heard. And the hero's stomach clenched as she relayed the details, because it confirmed his worst suspicion, that the council would rather murder their own saviors than risk sharing authority. And he thanked Mira and told her to keep her eyes open, and he quickly convened with Lysandra and the Council of Allies to share the information. And they decided to adjust their formations away from the inner wall sections most vulnerable to sabotage, even as they maintained the appearance of following the original plan, so as not to signal to the council that their betrayal was known. They returned to the battle with renewed vigilance, positioning Carrick engineers near wall sections suspected to be rigged, assigning meridians to watch for sudden surges of water that might signal a trap, and instructing sylphid scouts to keep an eye on the movements of council guards, all while continuing to repel demon assaults. And he felt a constant tension pulling at his mind, the need to focus on the present fight while anticipating treachery from supposed allies. And he reminded himself of his code, especially the vow to protect innocence even when wronged, and he resolved that if the council triggered their trap, he would save as many as he could, and not allow anger to turn him against the people he had sworn to protect. The council acted sooner than expected. During the next heavy demon push, when the coalition had successfully funneled a large contingent of demons into a kill zone near one of the inner walls, he heard a deep rumbling, different from the boom of demon claws or the crack of catapults, and he looked up to see the wall shudder. Mortar crumbling, stones shifting, and he shouted a warning just as a massive section of the barrier gave way, crashing down toward the Carrick and Salamander units stationed below. And he leaped forward, wings flaring, aura of unity pulsing, and he pushed several warriors out of the path of falling rubble, his back straining as he held up a beam long enough for meridians to surge and sweep others to safety. But despite their efforts, debris crushed several fighters, human and monster alike. As the dust settled, the demons rushed forward, taking advantage of the chaos, forcing him to fight while grieving the lives lost not to enemy claws but to human treachery. Later, when the immediate threat was repelled and wounded tended, he stormed to Captain Rowan, demanding to know who had ordered the wall collapse. And Rowan, his face ashen with realization, swore that he had given no such command and had only learned of the sabotage when he heard the crash. And he told him that the council had ordered all commanders to hold their positions, and he admitted that he had been locked out of strategy discussions that morning, and his frustration mirrored the heroes, and they both understood that the decision had come from above, from those who wielded political power rather than swords, and they vowed that once the demons were dealt with, this betrayal would be addressed, because the integrity of the alliance and the future of the kingdom depended on rooting out those who would sacrifice others for their own fear. The council's propaganda continued, with town criers spreading warnings that monsters were sabotaging defenses and that the hero had caused the wall collapse, and some frightened citizens, their trust already tenuous, began to throw stones and garbage at Meridian tendrils and Sylphid scouts, and a group of young soldiers refused to fight beside Carrick, their faces twisted in disgust, and he activated his aura of unity to calm tempers. But he also spoke to the crowd, his voice carrying over the din, explaining what had truly happened, naming no specific counselors but making clear that the collapse had been sabotage from those seeking to sow division. And Mira stood beside him, nodding vigorously, and Lysandra's shadows flared in emphasis. And some of the crowd listened, shame flickering across their faces, while others muttered and stalked away, clinging to their fears. In the midst of this turmoil, they discovered another trap, a series of sigils carved into the base of a wall section near the eastern gate. Hidden beneath loose stones, connected to barrels of powder and enchanted with dark magic that would have amplified the explosion. And it was a salamander scout, sensitive to changes in heat, who noticed the subtle warmth radiating from the stones. And they alerted him, and he and Lysandra carefully dismantled the ward, his claws delicately prying loose the triggering rune, while her shadows dampened the magical charge. And as he removed the final piece, a wave of nausea washed over him. Not from the magic, but from the realization that the council had planned multiple contingencies to ensure his death and the destruction of his allies. And he felt the anger surge again, but he let it flow through him and out, grounding himself in his code. He convened a brief meeting with the coalition leaders, informing them of the traps and the propaganda, and he reaffirmed his commitment to their safety, apologizing for bringing them into a battle where they were not only facing demons, but also treachery from those they sought to help. And Therick's eyes narrowed in anger. Nerissa's waters churned, the Sylphid Queen's wings fluttered with agitation, and the Salamander Elder's heat flared, but they all chose to stay, recognizing that the threat of the demon horde outweighed the council's treachery, and they expressed their support for confronting the council when the time came, some insisting that monsters be present at those discussions to ensure accountability, and he agreed, noting that justice would need to be seen and felt by all parties. Throughout the day and into the night, the battle raged, demons pouring through breaches only to be repelled by coordinated strikes. And with each successful defense, he saw the alliances strengthening, humans beginning to trust the meridian currents that saved their lives. Salamanders shielding human civilians with their fiery bodies, Carrick warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with human shields, and Sylphid weaving through the air to guide lost children to safety. And he clung to these images when discouragement threatened to overwhelm him, because they reminded him that the council did not represent all humans, that the bonds forged on the battlefield were stronger than the lies whispered in fear. Between clashes, he caught sight of the council tower, stone spire rising above the city like a finger-pointing blame, and he felt a resolve crystallize. Once the demon threat was neutralized, he would ascend that tower not in rage but in righteous determination, accompanied by his allies to demand accountability, to insist on a new governance that reflected the unity he saw on the ground. And he knew it would not be easy. That power rarely relinquished itself without a fight, but he also knew that the kingdom could not survive if it clung to leaders who would sacrifice their own people out of fear. As dusk settled and torches were lit along the walls, casting flickering shadows across blood-stained stones, he stood among his allies, sword in hand, the aura of unity pulsing softly, and he looked at the faces around him. Granite, water, fire, feather, flesh, and he felt exhaustion and fury and hope braided together. And he whispered to Lysandra that the council had shown its true face, and she squeezed his arm, her own eyes hard, and he lifted his gaze to the darkening sky, where bats fluttered and stars began to pierce the veil, and he promised himself that justice would come. But first, they had to survive the night, and with that vow anchored in his heart, he stepped forward to meet the next wave, determined to defend both the bodies and the ideals at stake. In the midst of coordinating defenses at the breached wall, sending Carrick to fortify and Meridians to flood new trenches, he was approached by a breathless sylphid scout, her wings vibrating with urgency. And she told him that a nearby farming village nestled in a valley 2 miles east had been overrun by a splinter group of demons that had broken off from the main horde, bypassing their defenses under cover of darkness, and that the villagers were trapped, and he felt the weight of choice press against his chest, to stay and maintain command at the city's wall, or to leave and save those innocents, and the tension in the air around him was palpable as allies awaited his decision. And he thought of his code, of the vow that protecting the innocent would always come before vengeance or strategy. And he told Captain Rowan and the council that he would lead a small detachment to the village, entrusting the city's defense to Rowan, Lysandra, and the council in his absence. Lysandra, upon hearing his decision, stepped forward, her expression unreadable, and she placed a hand on his arm, saying she would remain to monitor the council and protect the coalition from further treachery. And she asked if he was certain, and he nodded, feeling both the burden and the clarity of his choice. Because he knew that while the council's betrayal needed addressing, lives were hanging in the balance, and Tharic volunteered a handful of Carrick warriors, their massive frames capable of cutting through demon ranks, and the Sylphid Queen offered a squadron to scout ahead, and Mira insisted on joining her bow already slung over her shoulder, and together they set off at a run, leaving behind the din of battle for the eerie quiet of the countryside, punctuated by distant screams. As they ran, his mind churned, balancing logistical concerns: how many demons, which villagers, what terrain, against the deeper question of why he was compelled to respond personally when others could fight. And he realized that it was not about distrust of his allies, but about the promise he had made to himself and to those who still looked to him, even from behind fearful gazes. And he felt his heart pound, not only from exertion, but from the fierce commitment to not become what his enemies claimed, to not let the necessity of war erode the values that had guided him from the beginning. And the cold night air against his face reminded him that compassion and action could coexist with power. They reached the village to find it in chaos. Thatched roofs ablaze, barns toppled, demons with elongated limbs dragging livestock away, while others clawed at barred doors behind which children screamed. And without hesitation, he surged forward, his wings unfurling, Carrick warriors following like a rolling wall of stone, their hammers smashing demon skulls, and sylphids swooping low to distract and misdirect, and he wove through the melee with precision. Aura of unity pulsing outward to steady villagers who dared peek out. And he kicked in a door to find a family huddled in a corner, while a demon clawed through the window, and he lunged, claws sinking into demon flesh, yanking it backward and snapping its neck with a twist. And he turned to the family, their eyes wide, and he told them to run to the center of the village, where the Carrick had formed a protective circle. One demon, larger and more grotesque than the rest, had pinned a young girl against a barn wall, its maw opening to reveal rows of teeth, and he felt the beast within him roar in response. But he gripped it with controlled force, slamming it to the ground, and as it thrashed, He sensed that it was not merely a creature of rage, but one tethered by a chain of dark magic to a glowing sigil on its chest. And he drew the ancient seed from his belt, pressing it against the sigil. And he whispered words of purification he had learned from the temple, and light flared between his fingers, burning away the corruption, and the demon's limbs spasmed, then stilled, its eyes clearing from red to amber before closing peacefully. And he realized that even within this creature there had been something to save, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. As the last of the demons were dispatched or purified, they focused on quenching fires and tending wounds. And he lifted a fallen beam off an elderly man whose leg was pinned, his claws careful not to scratch the fragile human skin. And the man gasped, and looked up at him in terror, mixed with wonder, muttering a thank you, as if unsure whether to say it. And he smiled and helped him to his feet. And one small boy, soot-smudged and clutching a charred toy, looked up at him and whispered, "Are you the monster who saves people?" Métis knelt to be eye level, and replied softly, "I try to save who I can." And the boy nodded solemnly, then hugged him, arms barely reaching around his neck, and he felt tears sting his eyes, because in that moment, acceptance came not from years of trust-building or grand speeches, but from a simple act of protection. A human soldier armor bearing the councils. Crest arrived mid-rescue, panting sword drawn, and he barked at him to leave the villagers and return to the city, claiming that orders were to prioritize the wall. And the hero straightened, meeting the soldier's gaze evenly, and he stated, calmly but firmly, that orders which required abandoning innocence were orders he would not follow. And he asked the soldier whether his own conscience agreed with such commands, and the man hesitated, his eyes darting to the burned houses and the crying children. And his shoulders sagged, and he sheathed his sword, muttering that his place was here after all, and he set to work helping, and the hero silently thanked him, noting the small cracks forming in the council's control. Once the fires were out and the wounded tended, they gathered the villagers in the square and explained that they would escort them toward the city, or if they preferred, to nearby shelters being set up in fortified farmhouses. And some villagers looked at his claws and wings and shrank back, while others, including the family he had saved, stood taller and thanked him. And he told them that the demons were drawn by hatred and fear, and that unity was their strength. And he saw eyes widen in understanding, or at least in consideration. And he felt a spark of hope that seeds of trust might grow even here. They left a small detachment of Carrick and human soldiers to escort the villagers, and then he, Myra, and the remaining Carrick and Sylphid raced back toward the city, the adrenaline fading and exhaustion creeping into his limbs. And as they ran, Mira confessed that she had thought he might ignore the plea for help, given the chaos at the wall, and that she was ashamed of her doubt. And he told her that his code required him to act, and that he hoped more people would see that his actions consistently aligned with his words. And she smiled, her eyes catching the dawn light as it crept over the hills. Upon returning to the capital, he found that the coalition had managed to repel another demon assault in his absence, and Lysandra met him with a raised eyebrow, asking if he had found a new village to save, and he laughed weakly, the tension easing. And then his expression turned serious as he recounted what had happened. And the Council of Allies nodded, some looking angry that demons had circumvented their lines, others proud that he had upheld his code. And Thoric clapped him on the shoulder, saying that stone was strong because it did not yield to pressure, and he took this as a compliment. The system delivered a message. Reputation increased among common folk, which he read with a rueful smile. Because while recognition was useful for spreading truth, it was not his motivation, and he tucked the message away in his mind, focusing instead on the faces he had saved and the knowledge that his code could withstand even the pressures of war and betrayal. And he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a recharging of his emotional resilience. As night fell once more, and he and Lysandra stood atop a wall section, watching the horizon for the next wave, she asked him if he ever regretted choosing the monster path. And he turned to her, eyes reflecting the flicker of distant fires. He said that if being a monster meant having the strength to protect those who needed it, and the freedom to defy unjust orders, then he did not regret it for a moment. And she nodded, shadows dancing at her feet, and they both fell silent, readying themselves for whatever came next, knowing that their fight was far from over, but that their values remained intact. On the third night of the relentless siege, when his muscles felt like lead and his mind swirled with fatigue, the system pinged softly in his consciousness, offering a skill called Dominion of Fury that would unleash an unstoppable torrent of strength, reflexes, and destructive power for as long as he allowed rage to control him. Accompanied by a description of the drawbacks dampened empathy. It's an overpowering instinct to kill, and a prolonged recovery period during which remorse would be muted. And, as he read the glowing text, standing alone on a rampart overlooking the carnage below, he felt a visceral pull because the idea of ending the battle swiftly, of silencing demons and council alike in one sweeping display of dominance, was almost intoxicating after the endless grind of measured restraint. He gripped the cold stone of the parapet, the ancient seed pressing warmly against his hip, and he allowed himself to imagine, for just a moment, what it would feel like to let go, to give the beast within free rein, to feel claws lengthen and muscles surge, to be unburdened by hesitation and deliberation, to let anger and hurt flow outward without filter. And he thought of the council's sabotage, of the friends wounded and the innocents endangered. And he could feel a voice within him whispering that mercy had gained him enemies, that power would make betrayal impossible, that fear was a more reliable currency than trust. And he shook his head, as if trying to dislodge the whisper, but it clung, seductive in its simplicity. Closing his eyes, he saw a vision not unlike a nightmare himself, towering and monstrous, scales as black as midnight, his wings broad enough to darken the sky, his claws dripping with black blood, demons and humans alike cowering or lying broken at his feet, the city silent save for the crackle of fire. He saw council members kneeling, eyes wide with terror as he delivered judgment with a flick of his talon, and he watched as fear turned to subservience, as people obeyed without question, as monsters abandoned their distrust and followed him blindly. And for a heartbeat, there was a dark satisfaction in that image, but then the camera of his mind pulled back to reveal empty streets, children peeking from behind shuttered windows with hollow eyes, allies standing at a distance, their expressions empty, and Lysandra nowhere to be found, and he felt a hollow ache because power without connection felt like ash. Within the vision, his monstrous self turned toward him, eyes glowing with an inner fire, and spoke with a voice that was his own but deeper, more guttural, saying that compassion made him weak, that hesitation had cost lives, that monsters and humans needed a leader who would not flinch. And he retorted that power wielded without love curdled into tyranny, that fear bred resentment and rebellion, that lasting peace could not be built on broken spirits. And the monstrous self laughed, accusing him of naivety, showing him the council's betrayal as evidence, showing him the burned village. And he replied by showing memories of the elderly man muttering thanks, of the boy hugging his neck, of Carrick and humans slapping each other's backs, of Meridians lifting soldiers from the mud, and he let those memories form a barrier between him and the monstrous self, until the vision fractured and the throne crumbled. He opened his eyes to the real world and found Lysandra standing a few paces away, shadows around her feet stretched long in the moonlight. And she approached, concern etching lines on her otherwise composed face, and he told her about the skill, about the vision, about the temptation to let fury reign, and her gaze softened and then hardened. And she warned him that her shadow spirit had once offered her a similar, bargained complete control over darkness for the price of her conscience, and that resisting such offers was like strengthening a muscle. The first time was the hardest, but each refusal made the next easier. She reminded him that the system mirrored his desires, and that this temptation was also an opportunity to reaffirm his path. He listened, the tension in his shoulders easing as she spoke, and he thought of his code not as a rigid set of rules, but as a living promise, something that required consistent nurturing. And he opened the system interface and stared at the accept button for Dominion of Fury, feeling his pulse quicken, and then he deliberately touched decline, feeling both a rush of relief and a lingering sadness as the option vanished, replaced by the simple words, "Path maintained." And he breathed deeply, as if expelling the allure of the offer, thanked Lysandra for being there, knowing that sharing temptation stripped it of some of its power. The very next day, during a ferocious assault where demons swarmed with renewed vigor and exhaustion, threatened to slow his movements. He felt the flicker of anger and the memory of the discarded power tugging at the edges of his resolve, whispering that a quick burst of unstoppable fury could end it, but he clenched his jaw and instead called upon the aura of unity. Feeling its warmth spread through his allies, and he coordinated a precise counterattack, meridians creating whirlpools that sucked demons into Carrick hammers, Sylphid dropping oil on demon wings before salamanders ignited them. And he watched as strategy and cooperation achieved what rage might have. But without the collateral damage, and he felt a quiet pride, a validation that his choice had been right. That evening, when the demon wave finally receded and they regrouped, he shared the story of his temptation with the Council of Allies. And he encouraged them to speak up if they too were offered powers that felt too good to be true, and Theric nodded solemnly, recounting how a Carrick warrior had once found a vein of ore that gave his weapons the ability to drain life, only to find his own life withering each time he struck. And Nerissa spoke of currents that could drown armies, but also washed away entire villages. And the Sylphid Queen told of a melody that could bend minds, but also broke spirits. And they all agreed that power came with cost, and that together they would weigh such offers before acting. Yes. As he lay on his makeshift bed later, staring up at the stars visible through a shattered ceiling, he considered the future, what would happen once the demons were gone and the council confronted who would lead. And he felt the whisper of temptation again, but this time it was quieter, almost polite. And he answered it silently, that he would not become a king or dictator, that he would advocate for a council inclusive of all beings, human and monster, that he would act as mediator and guardian, but never ruler. And he resolved to step aside once his work was done, trusting that those who had fought beside him could carry forward the values they had forged together. The system sent him a succinct notification. Mental fortitude increased. Temptation resistance plus 5%. And he chuckled softly, despite the grim circumstances, appreciating the game-like acknowledgement of his internal struggle, and he wondered what a statistic could truly capture about the complexity of his decisions. But he accepted it. It's not as validation, but as a reminder that the system watched and learned, adapting to him as he adapted to it. In the quiet moments between strategizing and fighting, he took time to meditate, focusing on his breath and the sensation of the seed's warmth. And he reread his code, revising small phrases, reinforcing his commitment to balance and mercy, and he wrote a new line. Power is a tool, not a master. I wield it, it does not wield me. And he felt a calm settle over him, his mind clearer, his resolve firmer, because it not just rejected a temptation, but had transformed it into a lesson. As night fully settled and the demon roars echoed in the distance like thunder, he stood once more on the ramparts, Lysandra at his side and Mira nearby, and he looked out over the flickering torches and the dark silhouettes of allies, readying themselves for another wave. And he whispered to himself that he had confronted the temptation within and emerged with his humanity intact. And he smiled briefly, a small, private acknowledgement, and then he drew his sword, feeling the familiar weight in his hand and prepared to face external threats once again, knowing that the greatest battles were sometimes fought in the quiet recesses of the heart. Ask ChatGPT. When the last of the demons had been driven from the city, their bodies burning in green fire and leaving behind acrid smoke. And when the wounded were tended and the dead mourned, he knew that the moment had come to address the human council's betrayal, because leaving them in power after their attempts to sabotage, their own defenders would doom any fragile trust that had grown. And so he gathered a delegation that reflected the coalition he had built, Thorok, representing the Carrick. Nerissa, in a crystalline sphere carried by 2 meridians, the Sylphid Queen flitting between shoulders, a salamander elder radiating heat, Mira with her bow, and Captain Rowan with his soldiers, and Lysandra at his side, shadows coiling like a living cloak hand. Together they marched through streets, still littered with debris, past citizens who whispered and pointed, and they approached the council tower, its stones, now streaked with soot, its windows shattered in places, and the guards at its base tightened grips on their spears. He stepped forward, letting the aura of unity flare gently, calming the tension in the air, and he spoke to the guards, not as a commander, but as a fellow protector, reminding them that he had fought beside them, that the monsters behind him had saved their lives. The council they guarded had collapsed walls on their own comrades. And he asked them whether their loyalty was to the counselors seated in ivory chairs or to the people suffering in the streets. And he saw the conflict in their eyes, the flicker of recognition and shame, and slowly, one by one, they lowered their spears and stepped aside, allowing the delegation to enter the tower. And as they climbed the spiral stairs, the stone walls echoed with footsteps that seemed to carry the weight of history. The council chamber was an opulent room with high ceilings and stained glass windows depicting heroic scenes from the kingdom's past, and seated at a semicircular table were the counselors, their faces pale and drawn, some bandaged, all tense, and their eyes widened as the delegation entered, their gazes lingering on the granite skin of Theric and the flowing water of Nerissa. And he walked to the center of the room, meeting their gazes one by one, and he spoke clearly. Recounting the sabotage, the wall collapsed, timed to crush his allies. The hidden sigils connected to explosive barrels, the propaganda leaflets that had incited fear and division. And he laid a bundle of the leaflets on the table along with the dismantled runes, and he stated calmly that these acts constituted betrayal not only of him but of every citizen and soldier who fought and died believing the council would protect them. He demanded accountability, telling them that their positions were no longer tenable, that those who had plotted must step down and face judgment. And he proposed that a new governing body be formed inclusive of humans, monsters, and spirits with equal representation and shared decision-making. And he asserted that while he did not seek power for himself, he could not in good conscience allow those who had proven willing to sacrifice innocence to retain authority. And he pointed out that their attempts to kill him and his allies had nearly cost the city its life, because without the coalition's strength, the demons would have overrun them. The counselors bristled, some spluttering denials, one accusing him of staging the sabotage himself to justify a coup, another insisting that extraordinary measures were necessary during war, and yet another sneering that monsters had no place dictating human governance. And one counselor, a gaunt man with sharp features, tried to rally the guards by snapping an order to arrest the delegation, but Captain Rowan stepped forward, placing his hand on his sword hilt, and stated that he and his men would not lift a finger against those who had saved them. And the guards behind him nodded, their eyes hardening toward the council. And the gaunt counselor's mouth opened and closed before he sank back into his chair, sweat beading on his brow. Tharic slammed his fist on the table, the sound resonating like thunder, and said that the stone remembers betrayal and that the Karak do not forget. But he added that they also valued justice over vengeance, and that they were here not to kill, but to ensure accountability. And Nerissa's watery voice rose to say that the rivers carried whispers of truth, and that she had felt the currents of corruption seeping from this tower. And the Sylphid Queen landed on the table and pointed at a counselor with trembling wing, declaring that she had heard him instruct scribes to print the leaflets, and the man paled, stammering before confessing that he had been ordered by the gaunt counselor and his allies. And the gaunt counselor attempted to protest, but Lysandra's shadows coiled around his chair, pinning him in place without harming him, and he looked at the hero with hatred and fear. The tension in the room crackled like static, and for a moment it seemed that violence could erupt, but he raised his hands and repeated his code, that justice must be tempered with mercy. They were not here to kill. And he proposed the formation of a tribunal comprised of representatives from each faction to judge the counselors impartially, to determine guilt and appropriate punishment, whether exile, imprisonment, or loss of titles. And he promised that those who cooperated and accepted responsibility would be treated fairly, while those who resisted would face consequences. And he looked each counselor in the eye, using his perceptive ability to sense the blend of fear, guilt, and defiance, and he felt anger but also pity, recognizing that fear had driven them as much as greed. His words, combined with the silent presence of the allies and the guards' refusal to obey them, broke the counselors' resolve, and one by one, the majority of them stood and removed the chains of office from around their necks, placing them on the table, their hands trembling. And they agreed to stand trial before the tribunal, their shoulders sagging with a mix of relief and humiliation, and a few tried to flee, but were gently restrained. And only two truly resisted, the gaunt counselor who drew a dagger from his sleeve and lunged at him, and a woman with rings on every finger who began muttering a spell, and Lysandra stepped in, Shadow swallowing the dagger and twisting away the magic, while Captain Rowan tackled the gaunt man, disarming him without spilling blood. And he himself moved swiftly to subdue the woman, pinning her hands and whispering that it did not have to be this way, that she could still choose to face judgment honorably. And after a moment her shoulders slumped, and she nodded, tears filling her eyes. With the council effectively dissolved, he turned to Captain Rowan and Mira and suggested that a provisional council be formed. Immediately, composed of humans like Rowan who had proven their integrity, monsters like Theric and Nerissa, spirits like the Sylphid, queen and representatives from the common folk, and he emphasized that this body must be temporarily tasked with guiding the city through recovery and organizing the tribunal, and that elections or selections would be held once stability returned, and he insisted that he would not lead it. But he offered to serve as mediator and advisor, and the assembled allies nodded, some in surprise at his refusal to seize power, others in respect. They drafted a provisional agreement on the spot using parchment, ink, and blood where ink had spilled, outlining the responsibilities and protections of each group, the process for judging the former counselors, the commitments to honor the conditions set by the hidden kingdoms, and the promise to develop a more inclusive governance structure. And each leader signed or marked the document. Thurok, with a chisel mark, Nerissa, with a swirling glyph of water, the Sylphid Queen with a drop of dew, the Salamander Elder with a streak of soot, Captain Rowan with his signature Mira, with her bowstring pressed into wax, and Lysandra with a shadow imprint, and he added his name last, signing not as a title but simply as the bridge he had become. After securing the counselors and entrusting them to guarded chambers to await their tribunal, he stepped onto the balcony overlooking the square, where a crowd had gathered, murmuring, and he spoke to them, his voice amplified by the Sylphid, who carried his words like a breeze, and he told them of the council's betrayal and the new provisional council of the monsters and humans who had fought together and would now govern together, of the need for healing and vigilance, and he acknowledged the fear that change brought. But he urged them to remember the cooperation they had witnessed on the walls, and he promised that justice would be transparent and fair. And as he spoke, he saw faces soften. Some harden, many reflect hope, and when he finished, a few cheers rose, tentative but genuine. And he felt a shiver of awe at the trust being placed in this fragile new order. He descended the tower steps alongside his allies, the air outside cool and carrying the scent of rain. And he felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief, knowing that one part of his journey holding the corrupt to account had reached a turning point, but that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, because rebuilding a kingdom and maintaining alliances would require as much vigilance as fighting demons. And as they walked, the system chimed quietly, displaying a message. Quest completed. Judgment. And reckoning. New quest unlocked. Rebirth of a kingdom. And he smiled faintly, tucking the notification away, focusing, instead, on the feeling of solid ground under his feet and the steady presence of his friends around him. And he resolved to remain true to his code as they stepped into the uncertain dawn of a new era. Though the fires of battle had dimmed, and the Provisional Council now sat at a round table etched with symbols of unity, the true battle, the battle of hearts and minds, was only beginning, for the wounds left by betrayal, war, and prejudice ran deeper than any demon's claw. And as he sat at the edge of the city overlooking the cracked horizon, he understood that rebuilding structures was easy, but rebuilding trust was a war of its own. He visited the refugee camps first, their tents stitched from salvaged sails and scorched linen, their eyes filled with cautious hope and deep fatigue, and he spoke not as a savior or hero, but as a fellow survivor, kneeling beside elders with trembling hands and listening to children speak of the nightmares that still clawed at their sleep. And when a boy asked if the monsters would eat them, he smiled gently and called Theric over, letting the boy touch the stone warrior's palm. And when the boy laughed instead of screamed, he knew that small victories like this were seeds for a new future. But not everyone welcomed change, and he found graffiti scrawled in alleyways, slurs dripping in red paint across Monster-run bakeries and spirit-blessed fountains, and the whispers in the market were no longer of demon raids, but of tainted councils and beasts in human skins. And when he confronted the shopkeepers, their voices trembled with anger disguised as righteousness, claiming tradition was being drowned by foreign claws and fangs, and though he wanted to rage, to scream that unity had saved them, he only bowed his head and promised to return, not with swords, but with stories and truths that would cleanse hate better than any flame. At night, his dreams grew heavy. Haunted by faces of those he couldn't save, the soldiers crushed beneath collapsed ramparts. The villagers he arrived too late to rescue. The counselors who chose defiance over redemption, and in the silence, the system pulsed again, offering new upgrades. Dominion of obedience, which would allow him to command others' will, and purge of doubt, which could erase fear from their hearts, and for a breathless moment, he stared at the glowing choices, fingers twitching, aching to bring order. To silence dissent, but Lysandra's voice echoed beside him, reminding him that power without permission was tyranny in disguise. So he declined them once more, and instead chose a passive skill, empathic link, which let him feel the emotional state of those around him without invading their minds. And though the pain nearly shattered him, the rage of orphans, the bitterness of disenfranchised merchants, the grief of widows, it gave him clarity, a map of their brokenness, and he began to walk that map daily, not to fix them, but to let them see him bleed too. The first real fracture came when a faction of displaced nobles, stripped of their titles by the tribunal, staged a protest at the foot of the council tower draped in their ancestral banners and chanting for the reinstatement of true-born rule. And though the crowd was small, their voices were loud, bolstered by disinformation and desperation. And when soldiers approached, tension snapped like a drawn bowstring, and in the chaos, a stone was thrown, hitting a young salamander girl square in the face, her flames sputtering in shock. He arrived just as her father roared in anguish, his molten fists igniting, and guards raised their weapons. But he stepped between them, voice ringing like steel struck on stone, demanding stillness, pleading for calm. And he knelt before the girl, cradling her, pressing his palm against her wound. And he turned to the crowd not with fury, but grief, and asked, "Is this what you fought for? A kingdom where we burn our children because they burn a little brighter?" His words hung heavy, and silence fell like ash, and the noble leading the protest lowered his flag not in surrender but shame, and turned away. And in that moment, he realized that every day of peace would require tenfold the courage of war. He spent the following week creating the Pillar Accord, a document written not with law alone, but with empathy. Drafted by all races, all roles bakers and builders, warriors and weavers, even children whose voices drew pictures when words failed, and the accord promised equal voice. Sacred rights and open trial for all beings, but it also demanded that truth be told, even when it was ugly, and justice be blind, even when it hurt. To announce it, he stood atop the steps of Union, where once counselors declared war, and this time, with Lysandra beside him and his allies behind him, he declared peace, not the fragile, trembling kind that waits to be shattered, but the kind forged through shared scars and mutual survival. And when he finished, the crowd erupted, not in thunderous applause, but solemn nods, quiet acceptance, and in that stillness, he saw something stronger than glory: understanding. But even as peace budded, the system once more stirred, offering a private message: world event detected, anathema awakens. Prepare. And the air around him cooled, the sky above dimmed slightly, and he knew that peace was never permanent, not in a world that had tasted blood and vengeance. And so while he built bridges and calmed storms, he also began to gather strength, again not for conquest, but for defense. He visited the forge of Mir's people, where weapons whispered their names before they were even shaped. And he spoke to the Oracle of Winds, who told him that the next enemy would not come with horns or claws, but with ideas so sharp they'd slice unity at the root. And he met with children in schools, planting seeds of empathy that might bloom before the next war arrived. And in quiet moments, he meditated beside Lysandra, whose eyes still flickered with ancient grief and silent resilience. And on the final day of the chapter, when he stood atop the city wall watching the sun break through smoke-stained clouds, he whispered a vow not to be a hero, not to be a monster, but to be a shield, a bridge, and a reminder that even in a world built on betrayal, it is possible to forge peace from pain and hope from ash. In the deepest hours before dawn, when even the wind dared not stir and the city slept in uneasy peace, he stood alone on the parapets, gazing into the vast expanse of forest that lay beyond the outer walls, feeling a weight pressing against his chest, not from fear, but from the certainty that something ancient was waking. Something that had once been buried in both time and memory, now clawing its way back into the world with purpose. The system, which had remained quiet for days since the last cryptic warning, pulsed softly once again with a new alert. World event active. Anathema S fracture. Echoes of the First War resonate. And those words, though vague, struck with such force that he nearly staggered back, for the First War was a tale whispered to children to frighten them. A myth about beings that existed before time was measured in sunrises and kingdoms. He gathered his closest allies, Lysandra, Theric, Myra, and even Kale. The former Inquisitor, whose loyalty had grown from contempt, revealed the warning, and as they discussed, maps were unfurled and old scrolls translated, and in one brittle document they found mention of the Vault of Sorrow, a forgotten place where the remnants of the First War were entombed, sealed away by blood and sacrifice, never meant to be touched again. The journey began under twilight, their caravan small but determined, weaving through the jagged terrain of the ruptured veil, where gravity twisted and shadows bent around corners that no light touched, and each night the group took turns standing watch, haunted by dreams of forgotten languages and ancient screams, and even the bravest of them, hardened by sieges and betrayal, confessed to waking with tears in their eyes and the taste of ash on their tongues. As they drew closer to the coordinates marked on the scroll, nature itself seemed to resist their approach. Storms churned in the sky despite the lack of clouds. Trees wept black sap, and creatures once passive hissed with unnatural fear, as if something deep beneath the earth was radiating dread like heat from a dying sun. And it was Lysandra who first recognized the symptoms of world fracture syndrome, a phenomenon tied to collapsing barriers between realities. On the fifth night, they camped at the edge of a forgotten canyon, where statues of titans lay shattered and discovered their weapons rusted, but still humming, faintly with power. And when Kale knelt before one, he muttered a prayer, not for strength, but for forgiveness, and none dared ask him, for each in their group carried ghosts not yet named. At the canyon's core, they found it, the Vault of Sorrow, sealed beneath layers of runes, locked with a mechanism that pulsed with the same system energy the hero now carried within his veins. And when he touched it, the door did not open with violence, but with a whisper, a sigh of relief, as if even the vault itself was tired of waiting.
Oh.
And inside was not darkness, but memory-crystallized moments from an era before myth, before morality, before choice. Each step forward triggered a vision, flashes of beings made of light and hunger, of wars fought without purpose, of heroes who bled not for kingdoms but for stars, and he saw himself reflected in those ancient warriors, not as a savior, but as a continuation, a cycle, repeating because no one dared to break it. And it filled him with horror and clarity alike. In the heart of the vault stood a throne of bone and flame, and on it rested Anathema's heart, a relic said to contain the soul of the first. Betrayer, the one who taught gods how to lie, and mortals how to fear, and though it pulsed faintly, as if dormant, the system flared with urgency. Contact forbidden, direct exposure risks, total system corruption. Do you wish to proceed? His hand hovered above the relic, torn between destruction and understanding, and in that suspended moment, Lysandra placed her hand on his shoulder, whispering that some truths were better faced together, and with a nod he chose to interface. Not to wield, but to witness, and the visions that followed nearly tore him apart. He saw the origin of monsters not as curses, but as consequences, mutations born from divine guilt and mortal grief. And he saw the first betrayal, not of man by monster, but of hope by ambition, and when the memory released him, he collapsed, gasping, bleeding from his nose and ears, and the system whispered, synchronization complete. Legacy unlocked, herald of broken cycles. Outside the vault, the world had changed subtly, the sky darker. The stars, misaligned in the group, realized that merely accessing the heart had shifted reality's foundation slightly, a ripple they could no longer undo, and so they buried the vault again. Not to hide it, but to mark it. placing a ward stone above it inscribed with one word in the ancient tongue. Remember, returning to the city was not a triumph, but a burden, for now he knew. The war they had fought was merely an echo, and the true threat had always been ignorance, repeating itself through generations, and in his silence his allies saw the change. Not in power, but in sorrow, and they too felt it, the understanding that peace without knowledge was a veil easily torn. As the chapter ended, he stood before the United Council, laying the scrolls before them, declaring that they must rewrite their histories, not to glorify or condemn, but to remember, for only through truth could they hope to build a world where monsters did not rise from within. And as his voice carried through the chamber, the system offered no prompt, no reward, only silence, the kind that comes when destiny itself is holding its breath. The nights had grown restless since the vault had been disturbed, and though the sky looked the same to the untrained eye, he felt it, that subtle dissonance in the constellations. Like notes played slightly off-key, the stars blinking not with light, but with intention. As if some ancient gaze was now fixed upon the realm, watching, waiting, remembering. It began with the dreams, uninvited, vivid, and more real than waking life, where he stood beneath a sky without stars, surrounded by shadows that whispered his name not as a warning, but as an invocation. And when he awoke, sweat-soaked and trembling, the system would flicker momentarily, glitching in a way it never had before, displaying unreadable runes and echoing lines such as, "You are no longer outside the song." Lysandra noticed at first the shifts in behavior among the monsters and spirits that once found solace in the city's protection, how they now avoided moonlight, how their eyes gleamed too brightly, how their songs faltered mid-melody, as if something ancient had stolen the tune from their throats, and, when questioned, the eldest of them spoke of a myth nearly forgotten, the Song of Undoing, celestial hum once used to end realms quietly, mercifully, without fire or flood, just silence. In the Hall of Echoes, the library beneath the council chambers, they uncovered texts that trembled as they were read, scrolls that refused translation until touched by starlight, and in one such fragment, they found prophecy. When the vault opens and the stars blink wrong, the herald shall rise, and with him comes the final chorus. The words were written in the same script now tattooed in light across his system's interface. He was the herald now chosen not by desire but by consequence, and though he had no melody to sing, he felt the pressure of expectation pressing against his chest like a phantom blade. And as he stood before the city, looking at the people who had once feared him and now placed their hopes in him again, he felt the terrible weight of prophecy, the kind that did not promise victory, only endurance. To understand what the song was, and whether it could be stopped, he traveled with Lysandra to the coral monoliths, ancient towers built before language, carved with symphonic runes and bound by silent spells so deep even birds would not nest nearby. And in their center was a resonating stone, silent for centuries now, pulsing faintly in rhythm with his heartbeat. When he placed his hand upon it, he did not see visions, but heard them. Galaxies dying with a sigh, gods humming lullabies as they faded into entropy, civilizations that chose song over sword as their end. And the chorus that came was not mournful, it was beautiful, achingly so, and for a moment he understood why the end might be welcomed.
Ow.
But he was not ready to welcome it. The system offered him a choice then. Accept song fragment. Gain knowledge of silence. Cost, emotional anchor severance. And as the prompt blinked, he hesitated not because of the gain, but the cost. For severing his emotional anchors would mean losing what tethered him to humanity, to grief, to love, to memory, and in that frozen breath, Lysandra stepped forward, wrapping her fingers around his, grounding him. "Don't become the weapon they expect," she whispered. "Become the answer they never dared hope for." He declined the offer. Instead, they left the monolith and sought answers not from relics, but from the people, and he spent the following days listening to monsters, to humans, to hybrids and spirits, asking them not what they feared, but what they dreamed, and from their words. He began to weave a counter-hymn, not a song of ending, but one of becoming. Myra forged new instruments, blending spirit metal with resonant stones, and Kale gathered old hymns from desert priests and mountain shamans. And Tharok, silent as always, offered his drum's heavy, slow, deliberate teach beat like a heartbeat defying extinction. They called it the Song of Continuance, and it was not meant to drown out the final chorus, but to harmonize with it, to remind the cosmos that life was not an interruption of silence, but a verse worth repeating. On the equinox, when the stars aligned with the vault once more, he stood atop the central tower and played the song, his voice imperfect, cracked from battles and grief, but behind him thousands joined, children with flutes, elders with bells, monsters with harmonics deeper than any human throat could reach. And for one radiant moment, the city became a symphony. The system flickered, then stabilized. Alternate song registered. Frequency. Hope. But far beyond their reach, in a place where stars were born and forgotten, a single eye, open massive, ancient, infinite tanned, the voice that followed spoke in chords older than creation. The herald has chosen defiance. We must now listen. The skies above the capital had not changed in color or shape, but everyone who looked up could feel the difference of pressure, like the hush before thunder, like the moment a blade is drawn but not yet swung, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath in expectation of a final note that had yet to be sung. From the depths of space, the voice of the Watcher, the ancient consciousness behind the whispering stars, had stirred, drawn not by conquest nor curiosity, but by defiance, by the one mortal who had refused both annihilation and ascension, who had composed a third path between silence and song, between monster and man, between chosen and cast aside. The system flickered to life with a new prompt. World Pinnacle Event. The Cosmic Listening. Do you wish to sing before the Watcher? And though his allies protested, fearing a trap, he accepted with calm certainty. For this was the burden of the herald, not to fight, but to speak, not to win, but to be heard. A stare of starlight unfolded from the sky, a path no one else could see, and he walked it alone, each step echoing not across the earth, but within his soul, where every regret, every betrayal, every triumph rang like a note plucked on the strings of memory. At the summit, there was no throne, no god, no enemy, only a void, a vast and endless dark. And within it, the Watcher, not shaped like any beast or god, but a sphere of music and memory, revolving infinitely, its core pulsing with unresolved tension, a song that had no ending. He was offered one final prompt, glowing gold. Compose the last verse. One song shall end, one shall echo. Choose. The silence that followed was not absence, but invitation. He remembered everything: the child who became a soldier, the hero who became a weapon, the weapon who was discarded like broken glass, and the shattered man who had to choose whether to rebuild or destroy.
Ow.
Not with perfect pitch or celestial rhythm, but with truth, each word carved from grief and forgiveness, each note soaked in the blood of battles fought for people who never deserved him, each harmony shaped by the laughter of friends who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. He sang of second chances and the cost of mercy. He sang of betrayal, not as a curse, but as a wound that could be cauterized. He sang of monsters who wept and humans who raged. He sang of the vault, of the chorus, of the silence beneath the world. He sang of hope. When his voice gave out, the instruments of the world joined hymn drums of mountain trolls, flutes carved by river spirits, the rustling leaves of whispering forests, the heartbeat of children born during the sea, all rising in harmony, not to overpower the Watcher's silence, but to exist within it, beside it, alongside it. And the Watcher listened. For the first time in eternity, it did not respond with judgment, but reflection, its song shifting from dominance to duet. The galaxy blinking once, not in threat, but in acknowledgement. The system dimmed. Final message appeared. You were never chosen. You were never cursed. You simply chose. The starlight dissolved. He fell, not from grace, but into gravity, caught not by fate, but by Lysandra's arms, whose tears fell freely as she whispered, "It's over, isn't it?" And for once, he nodded without doubt. The world did not change overnight, but it changed truly. The council disbanded, replaced by a union of tribes and cities. The monsters stayed, not as subjects, but as citizens. The vault was sealed forever, not in fear, but in understanding. The song was taught to every child, not as a warning, but as a story of what it means to be heard. He refused titles, he refused crowns. He lived in a quiet home at the edge of the city. Sometimes he walked the old walls at night, humming to himself, feeling the stars pulse back, like an old friend nodding in rhythm. And when he finally passed, years later, not to blade or curse, but to time itself. The sky sang once, not loudly, not sadly, just a single lingering note, and the world listened forever.